Night settles over Vatican City like a velvet shroud, soft but suffocating, pressing against the ancient walls that have witnessed more secrets than any kingdom on earth. The tourists are gone. The clatter of shoes on marble has faded. Only the distant echo of bells lingers in the air, vibrating through the cold stone as if the city itself is whispering a warning. Beneath the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, the world feels frozen, suspended between heaven and a truth long buried in darkness. A single lantern flickers in the corridor of the Apostolic Archive. Its glow trembles, painting long, jagged shadows across columns that rise like pillars of time. An archivist, old, stooped, carrying the weight of more years than he dares to admit, walks slowly toward a door few have ever seen, and even fewer have ever entered. His hands shake not with age but with fear. Tonight, he is doing something forbidden. He reaches the end of the corridor, where a narrow iron door stands guarded by centuries of silence. Its metal is scarred, as if someone once tried to tear it open in desperation. Above it, barely visible, is an inscription carved in Latin. For the eyes of the anointed alone. The archivist pauses, listening for footsteps, for the slightest sign that he has been followed. But the Vatican sleeps, or pretends to. With trembling fingers, he inserts a small bronze key into the lock. The mechanism clicks like a whisper breaking after years of restraint. The door creaks open, revealing a spiral staircase descending into the earth. A cold draft escapes upward, carrying the smell of stone and something older than the church itself. He hesitates only a moment before beginning his descent, the lantern swinging lightly in his grip, casting fractured beams of gold across the walls. The deeper he goes, the less the Vatican resembles a holy sanctuary. The walls shift from polished marble to rough-hewn stone. The silence grows heavier, thick enough to feel on his skin. Somewhere far below, water drips rhythmically, marking time in a place where time has no dominion. When he reaches the bottom, his lantern illuminates a small wooden door reinforced with iron bands. This one has no keyhole, no lock, only a simple wooden slide that he pushes aside. Beyond it lies a chamber so small and cramped it feels like a room the world forgot. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, each packed with boxes, scrolls, and leather-bound volumes wrapped in thick cloth. Dust lies everywhere, untouched by breath or light for generations. Yet in the center of the room stands a pedestal smooth, polished, and unmistakably cared for. Something sacred rests here, protected even as the rest of the chamber decayed. The archivist steps closer, raising his lantern. On the pedestal lies a single object, a sealed wooden case, dark with age and carved with symbols no modern archivist recognizes. The carvings twist and interlock like vines choking a forgotten tree. At the center sits a small emblem, two intersecting lines that form a shape resembling a star, but not quite. A symbol erased from official records centuries ago. He touches the wooden lid as though touching the surface of a memory. His breath catches. The air around him seems to thicken, as if the chamber itself senses what he intends to do. For decades he has guarded this place, following orders he never questioned. But recently, a rumor, passed quietly between scholars and priests, has unsettled him. A claim that the church's earliest leaders were not only spiritual shepherds but heirs to something far more earthly. A bloodline, a lineage that did not end with martyrdom or legend, but one that continued, hidden, protected, feared. He lifts the lid. Inside the case rests a tightly rolled scroll bound with a faded red ribbon. The parchment is cracked but intact, its edges darkened by centuries of secrecy. Carefully, almost reverently, he unfastens the ribbon. As he unrolls the document, the lantern light reveals lines of ancient script, names, dates, connections traced in sprawling calligraphy. The archivist's breath trembles as he reads. Some names he recognizes from doctrine. Others were erased from history long ago. And then his eyes fall upon a passage he has only heard whispered in cautionary tales. A line describing the offspring of the first witness. A descendant believed to carry both divine favor and human vulnerability. His heart pounds. His hands shake. He forces himself to keep reading until he reaches the final entry, written in hurried strokes as if the scribe feared discovery. The last line is not a name but a command. Guard the blood. Hide the truth. The world must never know. A sound breaks the silence. A soft scuff, like a shoe on stone. The archivist freezes, lantern trembling in his grip. The chamber seems to contract, shadows tightening around him. He turns slowly, expecting to see a guard, a cardinal, perhaps even a figure he cannot explain. But the doorway is empty. Still, he knows he is not alone. The Vatican does not allow secrets to walk freely. And this secret, this fragile lineage recorded in fading ink, has shaped wars, silenced dissent, and erased entire families from history. The archivist understands now why his superiors forbade even the mention of genealogical inquiries, why certain scholars disappeared, why some truths never reached the public. Because this discovery could unravel everything. He gently re-rolls the scroll and places it back into the wooden case. But before closing the lid, he hesitates. The thought returns, intrusive and powerful. If the truth is this dangerous, then perhaps the world deserves to know. Perhaps the burden of secrecy has lasted long enough. He takes one last look at the script inside. His voice cracks as he whispers, barely audible in the suffocating dark. They will come for this. They will come for me. The lantern flickers. A cold breeze moves through the chamber though no door has opened. The archivist closes the case, extinguishes the light, and climbs the stairs with the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. Above him, the basilica stands silent, unmoving, watching, and somewhere deep in its foundations, the secret bloodline sleeps, waiting for the moment when the world is no longer able or willing to ignore it. Dawn breaks slowly over the ancient city of Jerusalem, casting a soft golden haze across the old stone streets. The morning light spills over rooftops, touching places where the first followers of a new faith once gathered in secret, whispering prayers beneath the fear of persecution. Long before the power of Rome, long before the Vatican's towering walls, there was only a small group of men and women who believed in a message that defied empires. They were fragile, hunted, yet destined to change the world. But among them, if old letters and lost testimonies are to be believed, was a figure whose story has never been allowed to surface fully, someone whose legacy was not only spiritual but familial. A lineage, a thread woven through history like a faint line of fire that refused to die out, no matter how desperately others tried to extinguish it. The earliest days of Christianity were turbulent. The apostles scattered across continents, carrying a message of hope while evading the authorities who saw them as rebels. They wrote letters in code, entrusted secrets only to those they believed completely, and often vanished into the pages of history without explanation. Yet in these early movements something happened, something the church later worked tirelessly to silence. The story begins not with the grand figures taught in religious tradition, but with the quieter ones. Unnamed followers, families, communities who sheltered fugitives, preserved teachings, and sometimes carried with them a burden far heavier than faith alone. They carried blood, the blood of someone whose connection to the origins of Christianity could destabilize everything the later church tried to control. For centuries, scholars puzzled over strange gaps in early texts. Mentions of a kinship of the witnesses, references to the seed of the chosen, and rumors that one apostle in particular had not died without leaving heirs. These were always dismissed as symbolic, poetic, or heretical. But documents unearthed in desert caves, coastal monasteries, and forgotten catacombs all hinted at the same uncomfortable possibility, that the foundations of early Christianity were entwined with an earthly family line. Records from the 2nd and 3rd centuries speak strangely of a household, whose members traveled between Judea and the eastern Mediterranean, protected by small Christian communities but feared by local Roman governors. Their names are rarely mentioned outright. Instead, the texts use symbols, branches, stars, circles, as if writing them plainly would bring danger. And history shows that such danger was real. Entire families disappeared overnight. Villages that harbored certain followers were burned. And religious leaders who questioned the official narratives were labeled heretics. Why, in a movement built on faith, was blood such a threat? The answer begins with a simple truth. Power. The early church was fractured into dozens of factions, each with its own interpretation of teachings. Some groups believed that leadership should be spiritual alone, chosen by prayer and consensus. Others believed authority must come from a direct connection to the original witnesses. And then there were whispers of a third belief, that someone carried the physical lineage of a foundational figure, someone whose bloodline would grant them an unchallengeable claim to leadership. If such a person existed, if descendants existed, they represented the most dangerous threat imaginable to the emerging institution. Doctrine could be debated, visions could be questioned, but blood was undeniable. As Christianity grew, spreading from humble homes to grand halls, its leaders understood they needed unity to survive. Rome was watching. Empires tolerated no rival authorities. And so, slowly, stories changed. Names were omitted. Lines in texts were erased, reshaped, rewritten. What had once been a movement of people, real, flawed, human, became a movement of ideas alone. The humanity was stripped away, replaced with symbolism. But not everything could be erased. In the 4th century, a scholar named Marcel Linus wrote of a family marked by the sign of the witness, who fled Jerusalem after the fall of the temple. His writings were suppressed. He vanished soon after, his home confiscated by church authorities. Another text, found in the ruins of a Syrian monastery, speaks cryptically of a branch carried westward, preserved in the blood of the faithful. The manuscript was hidden inside a wall, as if someone feared it would be destroyed. Centuries later, during the chaotic years of the Crusades, chroniclers in the Levant recorded meeting European knights who carried symbols said to trace back to early Judean families. Their claim was not political, it was ancestral. Some were mocked, others were killed. But the records remain, fragmented but persistent, clues pointing toward a lineage with roots deeper than aristocracy, deeper than royalty. A lineage tied to the very origins of faith. Even the Vatican's own scholars, when speaking privately, admit that early Christian history is full of silences, long, unnatural gaps where individuals simply disappear from the record. These gaps are not accidents. They are the result of deliberate scraping, selective preservation, forced simplicity. Because if the Church's authority depended on spiritual legitimacy alone, any hint of a competing bloodline had to be buried so deeply that no one could resurrect it. But history has a way of leaving crumbs. And every era produced at least one person who noticed something that did not fit. A bishop in the 800s who wondered why certain family names kept reappearing around church councils. A monk in the 1200s who copied genealogies that should not have existed. A priest in the 1500s who found, among confiscated books, a scroll linking a prominent European family to a Judean ancestor whose identity was intentionally obscured. Each time someone came close to uncovering the truth, their work ended abruptly. Their manuscripts were seized, their careers destroyed. Some died under mysterious circumstances. And the question that emerges is simple but unsettling. What truth was so dangerous, so destabilizing, that the Church spent centuries suffocating it? It was not a doctrine, not a prophecy, not a heretical teaching. It was a bloodline, a family whose existence threatened to shift the axis of power. A family whose story began in the shadows of Jerusalem and spread silently through lands and centuries. A lineage that survived not through wealth or armies, but through secrecy, whispers, and generations of quiet endurance. The archivist who opened the sealed case beneath the Vatican may not have known the full weight of what he held, but he understood the pattern, the silence, the fear, the erased names. The scroll he discovered was not the beginning of the story. It was a continuation of something that started 2,000 years earlier. Something the Church tried to bury, then forgot about, then remembered only in nightmares. And somewhere in the tangled branches of forgotten families, in the margins of suppressed texts, in the blood of people living ordinary lives today, that lineage still breathes. Waiting, watching, carrying a truth the Vatican has feared from the very beginning. The parchment was fragile. Its ink faded into the soft brown of age. Yet the words still pulsed with an energy that felt almost alive. When scholars first stumbled upon the controversial 9th century letter, they dismissed it as an anomaly, an orphan text with no home, no context, no author to trace. But that was before they read what was inside. Before they realized that this single piece of writing carried a secret powerful enough to fracture the narrative crafted by more than 1,000 years of doctrine. It was discovered in a place that should have been ordinary, a remote monastery perched on the rocky cliffs of Sardinia. Wind had battered its ancient walls for centuries, and time had reduced much of the structure to ruins. The monks who once lived there had long vanished, leaving behind little more than cracked stone, remnants of a chapel, and a library buried beneath collapse. It was here, deep in a hidden alcove behind a fallen pillar, that explorers found a small wooden chest sealed with wax. Inside it lay the letter, so unexpected, so out of place, that it immediately drew suspicion. The letter was unsigned. Its edges were worn, as though passed through many hands before being hidden away. Written in a precise, confident script, it detailed an event no historian had ever recorded. The unnamed author spoke of a gathering of clergy held in absolute secrecy, far from Rome and far from the public eye. The meeting centered around one terrifying revelation: the existence of a lineage tied to the origins of the Church. The tone of the letter was not simply fearful, it was frantic. The first lines described a document presented at the meeting, an older genealogy believed to date back to the 4th century. According to the letter, the genealogy did not trace bishops or martyrs, but a single family line beginning with what the author called the first witness. The implication was unmistakable. This was not a symbolic witness, not a metaphor. It was a blood descendant of one of the earliest figures of Christianity, someone whose heritage, if revealed, could challenge the entire structure of ecclesiastical power. The writer went on to describe arguments, panic, and the immediate order for the genealogy to be destroyed. But some bishops objected. They argued that erasing truth, no matter how dangerous, was a betrayal of the faith itself. Others insisted that the survival of the Church depended on burying the past. The letter recounted their exact words: "A truth that unseats the throne must be chained forever." What followed was a description of fear not of heresy, but of instability. If the lineage were known, if the descendants came forward, they might be seen as more legitimate than those chosen by councils and votes. They could claim the right to lead, not through political maneuvering or Rome's decree, but through blood. Blood that could not be rewritten. Blood that carried the weight of origin. And so the letter stated, with chilling clarity, that every copy of the genealogy was to be seized. The scribes responsible for preserving it were to be punished. Some were exiled, others simply vanished. A final command: let no trace remain in the memory of men. But the author knew something the others did not. He had kept one copy, hidden it, trusted it to a monastery far from Rome's reach. The letter then shifted in tone, becoming almost confessional. The writer admitted he feared he had made a mistake, that the truth he preserved could bring unimaginable consequences. He begged the future reader, whoever might one day discover his words, to judge him gently. "I have sinned in silence," he wrote, "but greater would be the sin to let truth die." And then, abruptly, the letter ended. No signature, no date, no explanation, just silence. When the first modern scholars read it, they felt a wave of disbelief. It was too explosive to accept easily. A secret genealogy? A bloodline linked to the foundations of Christianity? A bishop who risked everything to preserve evidence? It sounded like fantasy. Some researchers insisted it was a forgery, a medieval hoax written to provoke controversy. But when they analyzed the ink and parchment, the tests confirmed the letter's authenticity. Its age aligned with the late 800s. The linguistic style matched church correspondence of that era. Even the phrasing mirrored other ecclesiastical documents known to be genuine. It was real, and that terrified the scholars more than the content itself. Because if the letter was real, then so was the genealogy it described. The scholars who tried to study it found themselves facing resistance from unexpected places. Several reported sudden pressure from church officials urging them to redirect their research. Others said their funding was revoked without warning. In at least one case, a prominent historian who publicly discussed the letter, lost his university position and disappeared from academic circles. Officially, he retired early. Unofficially, no one could reach him afterward. The pattern was unmistakable. Those who got too close to the truth were pushed back into silence. But a few refused to be silenced. One of them was a young historian named Danilo Ferrante, who devoted years to tracing the origins of the letter. He followed clues the author likely never intended people to follow. He traveled across Europe, comparing handwriting samples, analyzing Latin idioms, studying forgotten regional archives. What he uncovered was both astonishing and unsettling. Evidence of a faction within the 9th century church dedicated to maintaining an unbroken line of succession, not spiritual but biological. Ferrante believed the letter's author had been part of this faction, a man who rebelled at the last moment, choosing preservation over obedience. His research led him to another claim. The descendants mentioned in the genealogy did not vanish. They resurfaced repeatedly over the centuries, tucked into obscure family trees, absorbed into European nobility, protected by groups that operated deep in the shadows. Ferrante was preparing to publish his findings when he mysteriously halted the project. According to colleagues, he became convinced he was being watched. He died months later. The cause was ruled accidental. His notes vanished. And yet, despite every attempt to bury the truth, the letter survived. It exists as a fractured window into a world where spiritual authority collided violently with biological heritage. A world where truth was not lost, it was buried alive. The letter should not exist. Its survival is a defiance of 1,000 years of suppression. And because it survived, a single question lingers like smoke in the air. If this one document escaped destruction, how many others were hidden, waiting to be found? The scrolls describing the hidden genealogy did more than hint at a lineage. They drew shadows around families whose names history only remembers in fragments. These were not the towering figures celebrated in textbooks or carved into marble monuments. They were quieter, subtler presences, threads woven into the edges of empires, never at the center, yet never truly disappearing. Bloodlines in the shadows. In the centuries following the mysterious council described in the secret letter, certain families began appearing in obscure records across Europe. Not in royal courts or political chronicles, but in the margins of monastic writings, in the personal diaries of traveling priests, in the footnotes of forgotten manuscripts. They were families whose existence seemed deliberately blurred, as though history itself was trying to unwrite them. One such family was said to have emerged in the rugged hills of Judea before drifting slowly toward the Mediterranean coast. They carried with them objects that seemed too old for their time: bronze seals, carved symbols, relics marked with a star-like emblem that scholars later connected to early Judean households. These families rarely stayed in one place for long. They were welcomed by small Christian communities yet remained suspiciously distant from central church authority. Priests wrote about them with caution, describing their strange blend of humility and importance, their uncanny ability to attract followers while evading scrutiny. They lived simply, yet traveled with an air of significance. They blended in, yet always stood slightly apart. And over the generations, these families moved westward. Some settled in isolated villages in Greece, others in the forests of southern Italy, still others in the mountains of southern France. At each stop, they left behind small traces, symbols carved into door frames, unusual naming traditions, documents written in scripts that did not match local languages. These fragments alone would have been curiosities, nothing more. But taken together, they formed a peculiarly consistent pattern. A pattern that aligned too perfectly with the genealogy described in the forbidden letter. Historians later discovered a curious detail. These families avoided positions of influence. They refused clerical titles, turned down invitations to join councils, and preferred to live on the periphery of society. It was as if they were protecting themselves or protecting something within themselves. They acted like a group that had been taught, generation after generation, to remain invisible. Yet, invisibility only works until someone starts to notice the pattern. In the 11th century, an inquisitive monk from Antioch encountered a family living near the eastern edge of the Byzantine Empire. He described them as keepers of an inheritance not of land nor wealth, but of story and covenant. When he asked them about their history, they answered with silence and unfaltering eyes. The monk later wrote that speaking to them felt like conversing with ghosts who remembered a world I had never known. This family vanished from local records soon after the monk's account. No death certificates, no relocation documents. Just a sudden absence, as though they dissolved into thin air. But a decade later, a similar family with similar symbols appeared on the outskirts of Venice, carrying the same star-like emblem on a ring worn by their eldest son. Coincidence? Or migration? The pattern repeated again and again. In France, a medieval priest recorded the arrival of a mysterious household during a time of religious conflict. They were educated beyond their station, possessing knowledge of ancient scriptures in languages the priest did not recognize. They lived quietly but attracted villagers with their calm presence, their healing practices, their uncanny wisdom. When church officials heard of them, they ordered the family questioned. Days before the interrogation, the household disappeared. Fled or warned, no one knows. Their house was found abandoned, candles still warm, scrolls missing, footprints leading into the forest. A century later, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, another family emerged bearing identical traits. Local legend called them the Keepers. No one knew what they were keeping. Some scholars believe these roaming families were descendants of the exiled child mentioned in Section 6 of the larger narrative. Others argue they were simply guardians, individuals entrusted with protecting the lineage, not necessarily carrying it themselves. But a third theory, whispered quietly in academic circles and dismissed publicly by church authorities, suggests something far more intriguing. That multiple branches of the bloodline survived, scattered intentionally across continents to avoid detection. If true, then the church's attempt to erase the lineage did not merely fail. It forced the lineage to become more resilient. A hidden dynasty, a dispersed royal line without a throne. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church's focus on doctrinal purity intensified. Councils met, heresies were condemned, and records were aggressively standardized. Yet throughout this process, subtle inconsistencies appear, small references that hint at the existence of influential families who were not part of the aristocracy or the papal hierarchy. Marginal notes in ecclesiastical registers mention the protected ones, the children of the covenant, and those whose suffering must be shielded. What suffering? What covenant? Who were they being protected from? To answer this, one must look at the events that seem to circle these families like predators. Periods of religious purging, forced conversions, and inquisitions always seem to coincide with attempts to force these hidden households closer to church control. But every time the families slipped away, sometimes just before soldiers arrived, sometimes by bribing officials, sometimes through networks of sympathetic clergy who believed the bloodline represented something sacred the church had lost. A peculiar story from the 13th century tells of a bishop in southern France who defied orders from Rome to hand over a family suspected of possessing forbidden heritage. The bishop sheltered them for months before secretly escorting them through mountain passes into Spain. The bishop was later excommunicated. The family was never found. These patterns, scattered across documents and continents, paint a portrait of people living in fear yet guided by purpose. They were not rebels or heretics. They were not trying to overthrow the church. They were trying to survive the church. One thing becomes clear. Every time the Vatican tightened its grip on history, these families vanished into the cracks before that history could consume them. It was as if an invisible web protected them. Monks, scholars, hermits, sympathetic priests. Each generation passing along whispered instructions. Stay hidden. Keep moving. Trust no one in red vestments. Protect the blood. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, these families had blended so deeply into the fabric of ordinary life that tracing them became nearly impossible. Their symbols faded, their languages shifted, their traditions softened, but their presence remained, quiet, enduring, watching as the world changed around them. And though they lived in the shadows, their influence surfaced unexpectedly. In art, in architecture, In the margins of manuscripts were scribes doodled symbols that matched those found in the Judean carvings of centuries before. Influence without credit. Presence without recognition. Bloodlines in the shadows. Unbroken. Unclaimed. Unforgotten. Waiting for the moment when history could no longer bury them. The great councils of the early church were meant to unify belief, to draw clear lines between truth and dissent, to consolidate the fragile, growing faith into a single voice. But behind the elegant theological debates, behind the hymns and prayers and the polite language of doctrine, something far more human was happening. A battle for power, a struggle for ownership, a quiet war over who would control not only Christianity's message, but its history. The Council of Nicaea, remembered as a monumental meeting of faith, was in reality a battlefield of contradictions. Bishops traveled from across continents, carrying not only scripture and conviction but fears, grudges, ambitions, and secrets. Some came as defenders of purity. Others came to silence rival interpretations. And hidden among them were a select few who came with another purpose entirely, to ensure that a certain lineage never surfaced again. Official history describes the council as a debate over theology, words, definitions, interpretations of divinity. But beneath the speeches and scrolls, whispers passed from bishop to bishop like smoldering embers. Rumors that an ancient genealogy still existed, that a bloodline tied to the earliest Christians had somehow survived, and that certain factions believed this bloodline threatened to overshadow the authority of any council, any pope, any church edict. According to scattered records and the controversial 9th century letter, one faction known informally as Custodes Arcana, the keepers of the secrets, arrived at Nicaea with a terrible goal. They intended to erase all remaining mentions of the lineage, to strike out names, obliterate connections, and turn blood into myth. For them, unity required a clean slate, a story written without the messy complications of family, inheritance, and earthly claims to sacred authority. But their opponents saw things differently. A smaller faction, scholars, mystics, and bishops with a more ancient perspective, felt the bloodline was part of the truth, not a threat to it. For them, the lineage represented continuity, a bridge between the human and the divine. They believed suppressing it was not only dishonest but spiritually reckless. These men had no ambitions of elevating descendants to positions of power. They simply believed truth should not be erased because it was inconvenient. Their disagreement was never recorded officially, but fragments of their letters reveal a deep and fearful division. One wrote, "We come not to debate God, but to bury men whose only sin is birth." Another wrote, "If this lineage is destroyed, the church will build its foundation upon silence instead of truth." The arguments grew heated. Meetings stretched late into the night. Alliances formed and dissolved in the span of hours. And slowly, the majority began to side with the keepers of the secrets. Not because they believed the lineage was dangerous, but because they feared the alternative. If the descendants ever appeared, if they ever stood before the world, if they ever claimed a connection stronger than councils or hierarchies, the authority of the church would fracture like glass. Fear won, and fear, once rooted in power, grows mercilessly. During the final days of the council, a series of quiet but decisive actions took place behind closed doors. Scribes were ordered to remove certain passages from early writings. Monks tasked with preserving genealogies were summoned and interrogated. Some were compelled to swear oaths of silence. Others were never seen again. Copies of disputed texts were burned, not in public bonfires, but in hidden hearths beneath stone chapels where no witness could record the destruction. One record describes a monk clutching a scroll and crying, "This is the last of them," before it was torn away. The scroll was never found. By the time the council concluded, the official documents presented to the world contained no mention of bloodlines, no hints of earthly inheritance connected to the apostles, no trace of an ancient family whose survival had once been whispered among early Christians. The silence was total, complete, surgical, and yet, even after the council's decisions solidified, not everyone accepted the outcome. A handful of dissenting bishops continued to guard fragments of the forbidden genealogy. Some hid them inside reliquaries. Others smuggled them to distant monasteries. A few entrusted them to families who had already spent generations on the run. These secret acts went unnoticed at first, but not forever. Within a decade, church agents began searching for the dissenters. Some bishops were accused of heresy. Others died suddenly with no explanation given. A few recanted under pressure, revealing the hiding places of scrolls and letters that were promptly confiscated. But every time one document was seized, another seemed to appear elsewhere. Every time a family was forced into hiding, another surfaced with symbols carved into their doorposts. Every time the Vatican believed the lineage had been erased, a rumor resurfaced that it still lived quietly among the faithful. Destroying names was easy. Destroying blood was not. The Council of Nicaea became a turning point, not just for theology, but for the secret war over history itself. The official narrative would dominate public understanding for centuries. But beneath that narrative lay a buried truth, that an entire dynasty had been intentionally silenced to protect the church from internal fracture. One scholar described the aftermath as a wound stitched shut with gold thread. It looked unified, holy, complete. But beneath the surface, infection remained. And yet the most astonishing part of the story was not what the council erased, but what it failed to erase. Because unknown to the bishops who voted and prayed and argued beneath the vaulted ceilings, a single child carrying the forbidden bloodline had already left Rome, smuggled out under cloak of night, carried toward a future no one could foresee. A child whose existence would whisper through history like a hidden heartbeat. A child who would ensure that the truth the council tried to silence would one day return, not as a rumor, not as a myth, but as a revelation waiting for its moment. Night fell over Rome like a warning. Torches hissed in alleyways. Cloaked figures moved through narrow streets where the ordinary sounds of city life had been swallowed by dread. Somewhere inside the labyrinth of stone and shadow, a child, no more than 6 years old, sat wrapped in a woolen cloak, unaware that every step taken that night would determine the fate of a bloodline that the church had sworn must never survive. The purge had begun quietly, a whispered order from men in scarlet robes, an unmarked scroll delivered to select bishops, a sudden tightening of surveillance around families rumored to descend from early Christian leaders. No announcements were made, no public accusations, just doors broken in the middle of the night, homes ransacked, people dragged into the streets and taken away without explanation. The child's family had lived in a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome, staying unnoticed for years. They kept to themselves, avoided public gatherings, avoided drawing attention. But secrecy only works until someone decides to look closely. One evening, soldiers appeared at their gate. By dawn, the house was empty, windows shattered, footprints trampled into the dust. And the child, miraculously, was nowhere to be found, because someone had intervened. A monk named Valerius, sworn to a life of silence, had watched over the family from a distance. He had been entrusted with a single task. If the purge ever began, he must protect the child, no matter the cost. He had no army, no allies, no authority, only conviction. And so, as soldiers stormed the villa, Valerius slipped through a hidden passage and carried the child away wrapped in a cloak, whispering prayers under his breath as though the words themselves could shield them. They fled through forgotten streets, the monk's breath ragged as he dodged patrols and cut through ruins older than the empire itself. The child clung to his robe, confused, terrified, yet oddly calm, as though sensing something within himself that neither fear nor darkness could extinguish. Valerius knew escape within Rome was impossible. Too many eyes watched, too many ears listened. Their only hope was to reach the countryside, to vanish beyond the reach of Rome's iron grip. But the journey would be perilous. Roads were guarded, villages filled with informants. The church's agents were relentless. They carried lists of names, descriptions, symbols associated with the forbidden bloodline. And on those lists was the child now in Valerius's arms. They reached the city walls at dawn. The gates were already opening for farmers and merchants. Perfect cover, but only if they moved quickly. Valerius walked with forced confidence, lowering his head, holding the child as though he were nothing more than a sleeping orphan. A guard stopped him, eyeing the bundle. "You travel early, brother," the guard said. Valerius nodded without speaking. "Where are you headed?" He pointed south, toward the farmlands. The guard stared a moment longer. Then, without warning, he reached for the edge of the cloak, about to expose the child's face. Before he could touch it, a commotion erupted behind them. A mule broke free from a cart, braying loudly, knocking over barrels. The guard turned instinctively, shouting orders. Valerius walked straight through the gates without looking back, heart pounding, thanking God or fate or chance. He could not tell which. Once outside the city, the monk followed old forest paths, avoiding main roads. The child slept most of the day, exhausted by fear and flight. At night, they rested beneath olive trees, the stars their only witnesses. Valerius told the child stories, not from scripture but from memory. Stories of ancestors who had walked the earth long before Rome, people who carried a spark the world could not extinguish. The child listened wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but absorbing every word like seeds planted in the dark. After 3 days, they reached the edge of a dense forest. Hidden deep within it was a monastery known only to a handful of wandering monks. It was a sanctuary for those fleeing persecution, a place where silence was not a burden but a shield. Valerius believed they would shelter the child, but others had anticipated his path. As they approached the monastery, figures emerged from the trees, soldiers dressed not in the garb of Rome, but in the robes of the church. Their leader stepped forward, holding a parchment bearing the broken seal of a cardinal. "Brother Valerius," he said coldly, "you carry something that does not belong to you." The monk's grip tightened around the child. He stepped back, eyes wide with panic. The soldiers moved in. Then, from the monastery gates, a bell tolled. A deep, resonant sound that cut through the forest like a warning. Monks poured out, forming a shield around Valerius and the child. Their leader, an elderly abbot with a long silver beard, raised his staff and shouted, "This child is under our protection." The soldiers hesitated. Monasteries were sacred ground, but orders from Rome left little room for mercy. The leader signaled again. The standoff tightened, and then the abbot spoke a phrase that froze every soldier in place. "This child bears the mark of the witness." A ripple of fear moved through the soldiers like a cold wind. They glanced at each other, suddenly unsure. The mark was a legend, spoken only in the deepest corners of church history, forbidden to repeat. A sign of lineage, a sign of danger. The soldiers withdrew. Fear, not faith, drove them away. The abbot led Valerius and the child inside, barring the doors with heavy beams. The sanctuary swallowed them in darkness and safety. For the first time in days, Valerius allowed himself to breathe. The monks tended to the child, offering food and warm blankets. But the abbot pulled Valerius aside and whispered urgently, "This place is safe for now, but the church will not stop. You must continue your journey." "Where?" Valerius asked. "To the mountains," the abbot replied. "There is a place where the bloodline once found refuge. You must take the child there." Valerius bowed his head, exhausted yet determined. He had carried the child through danger, through darkness, through the jaws of death itself. But the true journey had only begun. That night, as the child slept peacefully for the first time since Rome, Valerius gazed at him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. This child had no idea who he was, no idea what destiny pulsed through his veins, no idea what the world would try to take from him. But Valerius knew. He whispered softly, "You are the last hope of a story they wanted to erase." Outside, the wind howled like a warning across the monastery walls. The bloodline lived, and now it was running for its life. The monastery that sheltered the child was a quiet fortress carved into the forest, a place where centuries of silence clung to the stone like moss. But it was never meant to be a permanent refuge. Valerius knew this. The abbot knew this. Even the monks who prayed through the night understood that the church's reach was long, and its fear was relentless. If the bloodline was to survive, it needed a A map. Something that would guide the child far beyond the places Rome could search. Deep underneath the monastery, beneath the chapel and the scriptorium, lay a chamber almost no one knew existed. It was carved into the rock long before the first monk set foot in the region, its walls etched with patterns too ancient to place. The air was cool, still, heavy with the scent of damp stone. Torches flickered along the walls as Valerius followed the abbot down the narrow passage, unsure what awaited him. The abbot held a small clay jar, its wax seal cracked with age. "For centuries," he whispered, "our order has guarded something meant only for a moment like this. A guide, a warning, promise." Valerius said nothing. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The passage opened into a circular chamber lit by a single shaft of moonlight that fell through a crack in the ceiling. In the center stood a pedestal, not tall, not ornate, but carved with intricate symbols. Spirals, stars, branches. They matched the markings Valerius had seen once on a scroll entrusted to the child's family. The abbot placed the clay jar on the pedestal and broke the seal. Inside was a roll of parchment, older than anything Valerius had ever seen. Its edges were frayed, its surface cracked, but the ink, dark, bold, still survived. "This," the abbot said softly, "is the map." Valerius stared. "A map to where?" "To where the child must go." The parchment was carefully unrolled. What emerged was not a map in the traditional sense. There were no borders, no named kingdoms, no roads. Instead, swirling lines formed a path that seemed more spiritual than geographical. The drawings resembled constellations intertwined with forests and rivers. At the center was an unfamiliar symbol, two intersecting lines forming an elongated star, identical to the emblem carved on the ancient wooden case hidden beneath the Vatican. Valerius touched it gently. "What does it mean?" The abbot drew a slow breath. This map was carved by the guardians who protected the bloodline after the First Purge. They encoded their knowledge in symbols only descendants and protectors could understand. A language of the witness. You were taught parts of it as a child in the Brotherhood. Look again. Valerius traced the lines once more. Suddenly the shapes began to shift in meaning. What he had mistaken for stars were mountain peaks. The spiraling symbols were rivers winding through valleys. The central star was not just a symbol, it was a marker, point of convergence. "A kingdom," he murmured, "a hidden one." "Not hidden," the abbot corrected, "but forgotten. A place the church does not watch because it never understood its significance." Valerius looked up, realization dawning. "The cross-bearers." The abbot nodded slowly. Legends told of a small, ancient kingdom in the far reaches of Europe, isolated, weather-beaten, and nearly erased from memory. Its rulers were said to bear symbols older than Christianity, yet strikingly similar to those found in early Judean artifacts. Scholars dismissed these tales as folklore. The church treated them as superstition. But the monastery's oldest records suggested something different. That this kingdom had once sheltered those fleeing from Rome's persecution. That its rulers carried traces of Judean blood. That its soil, untouched by political ambition, might still protect those who needed to remain unseen. "The child must go there," the abbot said. "Only in that land will he be beyond Rome's detection." Valerius felt the weight of the map like a stone in his chest. The journey would be brutal: mountains, rivers, forests filled with bandits and soldiers. But the alternative was worse. If the child stayed, he would be caught. If he fell into the church's hands, the bloodline would end forever. "How will I know the kingdom when I reach it?" he asked. The abbot pointed to a faint marking near the edge of the parchment. 3 circles arranged in a vertical line. "Look for this symbol carved into stone," he said. "The cross-bearers marked their borders with it. When you see it, you will know you are close." Valerius nodded, memorizing every curve and line. The map seemed alive, pulsating with purpose. It was more than guidance, it was destiny drawn on parchment. Before leaving the chamber, the abbot placed his hand on Valerius's shoulder. "You were chosen for this not because of strength," he said, "but because you understand what is at stake. Empires rise and fall. Kingdoms burn. Scholars rewrite truth. But blood carries memory. If the church fears this child, it is because his existence reminds them of the one thing they cannot command. What is that? Valerius whispered. Origin, the abbot said. The story before the story. When they returned above ground, dawn was creeping across the horizon. The forest outside the monastery shimmered with dew. The child stood with a satchel slung across his small shoulders, ready to travel though he did not know where. Valerius knelt before him. We must go on a long journey, he said gently. A journey only you can complete. The child looked at him with innocent, knowing eyes that held a depth far beyond his years. Why me? He asked softly. Valerius swallowed. Because you carry something precious. Something older than Rome. Older than the church. A story they tried to erase. The child nodded, accepting the words even if he did not fully understand them. The monks gathered at the gate, offering final blessings. One handed Valerius a small pouch containing dried herbs and healing roots. Another slipped him a clay vial of sacred oil. The abbot himself pressed a carved wooden charm into the child's palm, the same star-like emblem etched into the map. It will guide you when the world turns dark, the abbot said. And then, with nothing but a map of symbols and a child whose destiny was older than any kingdom, Valerius stepped into the forest. The monastery bell rang behind them, slow, solemn, echoing through the trees like a farewell that stretched across centuries. The forest swallowed their silhouettes. The map whispered its secrets. And somewhere beyond mountains and forgotten borders, a kingdom waited, untouched, unspoiled, unaware that the last survivor of a forbidden bloodline was coming home. The journey to the forgotten kingdom was long enough to blur seasons. Forests bled into valleys, valleys dissolved into rolling hills, and hills gave way to mountains jagged as broken teeth. Valerius and the child traveled mostly by night, guided only by the stars and the strange symbolic map carved centuries before. The world grew colder as they moved north, as though the land itself resisted their arrival. On the 17th night since leaving the monastery, they crossed a narrow stone bridge arching over a roaring river, a river that matched the spirals on the ancient map. Valerius paused, tracing the symbol in the air. They were getting close. By dawn, they reached the edge of a vast, wind-swept plateau. Mist clung low to the earth, crawling like a living thing across the cracked ground. In the distance, cloaked by fog and silence, rose towering monoliths of stone, pillars carved by hands long forgotten. Each one bore the same symbol the abbot had shown them, 3 circles aligned vertically. The child stepped toward them with wide eyes. What are they? He whispered. Markers, Valerius replied softly. The border of a kingdom that once guarded the blood you carry. The pillars loomed like watchmen of stone, their surfaces weathered but unbroken. They had survived storms, wars, empires, and now they stood witness once more as 2 travelers crossed into their ancient realm. The land beyond the stone sentinels felt different, older, heavy with echoes. The wind carried a whistle like distant voices. Trees twisted into shapes that resembled symbols carved in the monastery below. It was as though the earth itself whispered the memory of those who had once walked here. The path narrowed into a rugged trail etched along the mountainside. At its end, hidden within a valley surrounded by steep cliffs, sat the forgotten kingdom of the crossbearers. It was smaller than Valerius expected. Not a city, not even a proper town, but a cluster of stone structures half sunk into the ground. Moss covered their walls. Ivy strangled old archways. Roofs had collapsed under centuries of snow. Yet the silence that hung over the ruins was not the silence of decay. It was the silence of preservation. A hush as though the land itself guarded something sacred. Valerius approached cautiously. Stay close to me, he told the child. They crossed an old gate made of stone and earth, its arch inscribed with a symbol that had appeared repeatedly on the map. The elongated star, carved with reverence. The child raised a hand and traced its outline, his small fingers trembling with an instinct he did not understand. Do you feel it? Valerius asked quietly. The child nodded. Like Like it's listening. Valerius's breath caught. The legends had spoken of this, of the land reacting to the presence of the rightful lineage. The ground beneath them felt warmer, the air less harsh. Places of old blood recognized their own. They moved deeper into the ruins. Streets once lined with life now lay cracked and broken. A stone well sat in the center of a square, its rope long rotted away. Houses made of thick stone leaned precariously, yet still carried carvings of ancient Judean motifs mixed with early Christian shapes. Stars, branches, and crosses blended together in a language lost to time. The crossbearers had not been ordinary rulers. They were guardians of a heritage older than Europe itself. A kingdom built not on conquest, but on exile. Refugees who had pledged their lives to protecting the descendants fleeing Rome. Their loyalty had been woven into stone, etched into their walls, hidden in their symbols. Valerius stopped at a circular platform in the heart of the ruins. The platform bore carvings so precise they seemed recent, untouched by erosion. At its center was the symbol of the intersecting star, the same one the child carried around his neck. Here, Valerius murmured. This was their gathering place. The child stepped onto the platform. As soon as his foot touched the stone, a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, swirling dust and leaves in a spiral around him. Valerius shielded his eyes, startled. The child stood still, watching the whirlwind with calm curiosity. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the wind died. Everything fell silent again. Valerius realized the truth in that instant. The land was responding to him. The bloodline had returned after centuries of absence. The kingdom, though abandoned, recognized its heir. As daylight faded, they sought shelter in what had once been the kingdom's central hall, a tall structure with broken pillars that still reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Valerius lit a small fire from dry roots he gathered near the riverbank. The child sat close to the flames, warming his hands. "Who lived here?" he asked. "People who carried part of your history," Valerius answered. "People who protected the ones who came before you." "Why did they leave?" Valerius glanced at the shattered roof, the empty windows, the shadows dancing along the walls. Because the world changed around them. The church grew stronger. The borders shifted. Wars came, storms came. But most of all, they left so the bloodline could scatter far enough that no single blow could destroy it. The child pondered this in silence. When the fire dimmed and night wrapped the ruins in darkness, Valerius walked outside alone. He gazed at the stars, the same constellations carved into the ancient map. The sky above this forgotten kingdom seemed clearer, brighter, as though the heavens themselves bent closer to the earth. He knelt in the dust, tracing the symbols on the stone platform again and again, feeling something stir beneath the surface. A resonance, a memory, and then he saw it, a glint of metal inside a cracked stone pillar. He reached into the crevice and pulled out a small bronze medallion, worn smooth, but still bearing the unmistakable elongated star. It had been hidden intentionally, protected from time. Valerius's heart pounded. Someone, centuries ago, had left this here for a moment just like this. He carried it back to the child. "What is it?" the boy asked. "A sign," Valerius whispered. "A message from those who came before you. They wanted you to know. You are not the first, and you are not alone." The child stared at the medallion with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, he seemed far older than his small frame suggested, as though a memory buried deep in his blood was rising to the surface. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the ruins like a voice calling across centuries. And in that forgotten kingdom, carved from stone, silence, and sacrifice, the child who carried the forbidden bloodline finally stepped into the legacy the world had tried to erase. A legacy that had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment, waiting for history to awaken. The tomb lay at the far end of the forgotten kingdom, half buried under centuries of earth and shifting stone. Valerius discovered it almost by accident. He had followed a faint trail of carvings, stars etched into boulders, lines forming spirals on ancient doorframes, until they converged at the base of a cliff. There, hidden beneath thick roots and moss, was a slab of stone shaped like a doorway. The earth around it felt strangely warm, as if it breathed. The child stood beside him, drawn to the place with an instinct he couldn't explain. His eyes tracked the carved symbol at the center of the stone slab. The elongated star, carved deeper and more precisely than anywhere else in the ruins. Valerius brushed away dirt and vines. "Someone sealed this intentionally," he murmured. "Not to keep us out, but to keep something safe inside." Together they pushed. The slab shifted with a groan, then slid open just enough to reveal a narrow passage descending into darkness. A cold drift of air escaped from the opening, carrying the scent of ancient dust and the faint metallic tang of old stone. The child hesitated. "Is it dangerous?" Valerius touched his shoulder gently. "The danger outside is far greater than anything in here." They stepped inside. The passage grew tighter as they descended. Candlelight flickered along the walls, revealing carvings that spiraled like galaxies. Symbols the child's ancestors once used to encode memory. The deeper they walked, the stronger the sense of presence became. Not a haunting, but a waiting. At last, the passage widened into a chamber. It was small, circular, carved into the rock with astonishing precision. The walls were lined with stone shelves, each holding clay lamps long extinguished. In the center of the room, raised on a pedestal of smooth granite, rested a sarcophagus. Its lid was not adorned with crosses or Christian iconography. Instead, it bore the unmistakable star symbol. Yet here it was surrounded by finely carved Hebrew letters, a fusion of cultures, eras, identities, a signature of a lineage that refused to be contained by any single history. The child approached slowly, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. "Who is inside?" Valerius swallowed hard. "Someone connected to you, someone they didn't want the world to remember." He knelt beside the sarcophagus, running his hands along the carvings. The Hebrew script was weathered but legible. He traced the characters, whispering them under his breath. A name, a lineage, a message intended for the future. Valerius froze. This is a royal burial," he whispered. "But not of a European king." The child looked at him, puzzled. "Then of who?" Valerius drew a trembling breath. "Of someone whose ancestors came from Judea. Someone who fled persecution long before you." The candlelight trembled, as though the air itself recoiled at the truth. He scraped away more dirt. Beneath the dust lay a second line of text, older, more jagged. When he sounded it out, his voice wavered. "This person was of the lineage of the witness." The child felt the words inside his bones. This was no ordinary burial place. This was a secret crypt meant to preserve the memory the church had tried so feverishly to erase. Valerius tried to lift the lid. It resisted at first, sealed by centuries. But with the child's help, it shifted. A cold gust escaped, carrying the scent of preserved linen and old oils. Inside lay a body wrapped tightly in layers of fine cloth patterned with oxidized threads of gold. Time had taken its toll, but the preserved form still radiated dignity. Resting atop the linen, placed deliberately, was a carved wooden pendant identical to the one the child wore. Valerius's breath caught. "It's the same symbol, passed down through centuries." The child touched the pendant gently, as if meeting a distant ancestor. Valerius scanned the interior of the sarcophagus for more clues. Along the inner walls, carved texts recorded fragments of a story. A great flight from Rome, a safe haven built in these mountains, a dynasty born of refuge and sworn to secrecy. Then he uncovered something even more startling. Small metal containers tucked into the corners of the sarcophagus. He opened the first and found thin sheets of beaten copper inscribed with lines of text. A genealogy, names, birthplaces, movements across continents. The child leaned closer. "What does it say?" Valerius stared in shock. This traces the line of the witness. From Judea to here, this person was part of your lineage. You are connected to them by blood." The child looked at the preserved figure in the sarcophagus, his voice barely a whisper. They protected us, even when I didn't exist yet. Valerius nodded. And they left this so one day someone like you could find it. As he read deeper into the inscriptions, he discovered something even more unsettling. The genealogy extended beyond the tomb's occupant. It listed the names of descendants scattered across Europe, some in Italy, others in France, a few farther north. It described marriages hidden from church records, movements disguised as pilgrimages, children raised under assumed names. A secret population silently carrying the forbidden blood. Valerius trembled. This confirms everything the church feared. He knew what it meant. If these copper sheets ever reached Rome, the church would suppress them instantly. They would destroy the tomb, erase the kingdom's ruins, and hunt down anyone who dared speak of the bloodline. He carefully returned the sheets to their place and replaced the lid slightly, leaving the ancestor to rest. But before they left, he noticed one more object, tucked beneath the ancestor's hands. A stone tablet, small and rectangular, engraved with a symbol he had never seen before. It resembled the elongated star, but fractured into two halves. "What is this?" Valerius asked. The child stared at it for a long moment, then spoke softly. "It's not broken." "What do you mean?" "It's two paths," the child said, his voice distant, almost trance-like. "Two branches." Valerius felt the air tighten around them. Two branches. Not one bloodline. Two. The implications struck him like a blow. The church had hunted one lineage for centuries, unaware that another had survived elsewhere. Another family. Another hidden dynasty. Another thread of the same forbidden origin. Valerius's pulse quickened. If there are two lines, the church's purge failed before it even began. The child nodded slowly. They looked only where the light was. They never searched in the dark. They stood in silence as the weight of the revelation settled around them. The tomb was not a burial place. It was a testament, a message across time, a declaration that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be extinguished. Valerius extinguished the candle and guided the child back through the narrow passage. As they emerged into daylight, the wind swept across the ruins, carrying with it the quiet promise of lives once lived, sacrifices once made, secrets once kept. The child looked back at the sealed tomb one last time. "I will not forget," he whispered. The kingdom had given him its past. Now the world outside would soon test his future. The story of the Pope who knew too much does not begin in the splendor of the Vatican, but in the dim quiet of a private study, lit only by a faint glow of candle flame reflecting off polished marble floors. It was here, in the heart of the 13th century, that Pope Lucianus II sat hunched over fragile documents he was never meant to see. They had arrived in his hands by accident, or perhaps by destiny. A messenger from a distant monastery had delivered a sealed package, believing it contained innocuous correspondence. Instead, it held a fragment of something ancient, something forbidden. Inside were lines of genealogical markings that matched no known family trees in Rome. Names written in a script older than Latin but unmistakably tied to early Judean tradition. At first, the Pope dismissed them as relics of scholarly curiosity. But as he traced the path of the names, he froze. Certain symbols repeated themselves. Stars, crosses, and spirals identical to those found on the earliest Christian artifacts. One name in particular stood out, marked with a sign that made his hands tremble. A descendant of the first witness. A bloodline they had sworn centuries ago to erase. Lucianus was not like the popes who came before him. He believed in truth, not power. He believed that faith could withstand revelation, that the church should not fear history but confront it. And so he read further, deeper, until the candle burned low and his eyes ached. Piece by piece, a hidden world unfolded before him. Families chased into exile, kingdoms built on refuge, a lineage running like a faint thread beneath the vast tapestry of Europe. When he finished reading, he whispered into the silence, "My God, what have we done?" In the days that followed, the Pope withdrew from public ceremonies. He appeared pale, distracted, burdened. The cardinals noticed immediately. They exchanged worried glances, whispered in corridors, asked the papal physician to check his health. But no illness could explain the fear in his eyes. Lucianus understood the danger of what he had uncovered. If this lineage existed, if descendants were still alive, then the Church's entire structure of authority, built over centuries, could be shaken. But instead of silencing the truth, he resolved to bring it to light. One night, he drafted a private letter addressed to the College of Cardinals. Its contents were never fully recovered, but fragments preserved by monks centuries later reveal its intent. We cannot continue to govern in the shadow of omission. The truth, however heavy, belongs not to us but to history. He planned to read the full letter at the next gathering of the college. A radical act, perhaps even suicidal. But Lucianus believed transparency was the only path forward. For days he prayed in the Chapel of Tears, asking for strength, demanding wisdom from a God whose silence felt heavier than stone. But the closer he came to revealing the truth, the more closely he was watched. There were factions within the Vatican, powerful ones, who had dedicated their existence to protecting the secrecy of the lineage. Some had forgotten the reason behind the suppression. Others remembered all too well. Their allegiance was not to truth, but to preservation, to order, to survival of the institution at any cost. When whispers reached the ears of these guardians, that the Pope had uncovered records tied to the forbidden genealogy, they acted swiftly. On the evening before Lucianus was set to address the College of Cardinals, a storm rolled across Rome. Lightning cracked above the basilica, rattling its massive dome. The Pope was last seen in his study, reviewing the ancient documents once more, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. He never left that room alive. The next morning, Vatican officials announced that the Pope had died in his sleep from sudden heart failure. Peaceful death, they claimed, a natural one. But those who had seen his body whispered otherwise. His servants spoke of bruises along his throat, of ink smeared across the desk as though a hand had been dragged violently over his half-written letter. The fragments of the ancient genealogy he had studied were gone, replaced by a neat, empty parchment. His private journal, where he wrote his reflections, fears, and spiritual confessions, vanished without a trace. The Vatican ordered an immediate funeral, faster than protocol allowed. No autopsy, no public viewing. His chambers sealed. His belongings catalogued by a small group of clerics loyal to the faction that wanted the truth buried. But they made a mistake. One page of his private journal had been missed. Perhaps it had fallen behind a desk. Perhaps a sympathetic servant hid it. Whatever the reason, the page resurfaced years later in a library far from Rome. Found in the back of a manuscript, stitched between unrelated pages as if someone had tried to smuggle it away. That single sheet of parchment contained a chilling line. I have glimpsed the lineage they feared, and in fearing it, they have sinned against truth. Tomorrow I speak, if God wills me breath. The ink faded abruptly mid-sentence, as though the pen had been ripped from his hand. The discovery of that page centuries later ignited controversy and suspicion. Some scholars dismissed it as a forgery. Others argued it matched the handwriting of Pope Lucianus precisely. But those who truly understood Vatican history saw something familiar in the pattern. A pope attempting to reveal a truth the Church was not ready to confront, and dying at the exact moment his knowledge became dangerous. Lucianus became a ghost in official Church memory. His writings censored, his reforms undone, his intentions erased. Only a polished image remained, a gentle pope who died quietly in his sleep. But the truth lingered in shadows. He had seen too much. He had understood too much. And he had come too close to revealing the lineage the Church had buried for centuries. The Vatican believed the story died with him. But the missing genealogy fragments he reviewed, the ones he had been ready to expose, did not vanish completely. Somewhere, in a monastery hidden from Rome's gaze, a single page survived. A page that would lead historians, centuries later, to southern France, and to the next chapter of the bloodline story. The fragment of Pope Lucianus's journal should never have survived. It should have remained buried beneath Vatican drawers, locked behind walls of silence, erased like countless documents before it. Yet somehow it escaped, torn free from the machinery of suppression and smuggled into the hands of monks who understood its value even if they dared not speak it. For centuries it lay hidden inside an unmarked manuscript in a quiet, forgotten corner of a provincial library in Avignon, France. It was discovered not by a historian or a priest, but by a young scholar cataloging damaged texts for restoration. He found it when a brittle spine cracked open and a faded slip of vellum fluttered to the floor. At first, he ignored the strange handwriting, assuming it was a misplaced annotation. But then he recognized the curvature of the letters, the punctuation marks, the rhythm of the Latin. This was the handwriting of a pope. He hurriedly brought it to his supervisor, who dismissed it as a medieval imitation. But the young scholar refused to abandon the mystery. He compared the fragment to authenticated letters of Pope Lucianus II stored in Avignon's archives. Every stroke matched, every curvature aligned, every nuance of ink flow confirmed the truth. The fragment was real. It contained barely a paragraph, its edges torn sharply as if ripped hastily from a larger book. But those few sentences carried a gravity that chilled every scholar who read them. A line of witnesses preserved from the wolves in red and gold. They are hidden, scattered, protected by a covenant older than Rome. Should they be silenced, the stones themselves will cry out. The last line ended abruptly, cut mid-thought. The wolves in red and gold. A phrase no pope would carelessly write. A phrase that referred too directly to the powerful cardinals who had opposed him. And there was more. Near the bottom of the fragment, inked faintly as if added in desperate haste, was a row of numbers. Not dates, not scripture references. Coordinates, encoded in the style of old monastic maps. Coordinates pointing to a very specific region of southern France. The foothills of Languedoc. A land long associated with rebellion, mysticism, and ancient heresies. A land that had once sheltered a people whom Rome sought to obliterate. The Cathars. News of the fragment rippled through academic circles like a shockwave. Historians debated its authenticity. The Vatican made no official statement, but privately they sent discreet requests to inspect the fragment. Requests the library politely declined. The scholars sensed the danger. They had become custodians of something Rome had failed to eliminate. Within months, a small research team assembled to follow the coordinates hidden in the papal fragment. Among them was the young scholar who had first discovered the page. Alongside him were two linguists, an archaeologist specializing in medieval cultures, and an elderly historian who had spent his life studying suppressed Christian sections. They traveled quietly, avoiding attention, their journey guided by a mixture of scholarly curiosity and unspoken dread. When they arrived in Languedoc, they found a landscape shaped by memory. Rolling hills dotted with ruins, old fortresses perched on cliffs, villages untouched by time. The region was haunted by a history of bloodshed. During the crusade against the Cathars, tens of thousands had been slaughtered. Entire towns burned, knowledge destroyed, families erased, and yet something had survived. The coordinates led the team to an abandoned monastery nestled among vineyards. Its roof had collapsed long ago. Ivy strangled its walls, but the foundations were intact, its stone arches still standing like ribs of a long-dead creature. Inside, dust swirled in shafts of light. Pigeons fluttered in the rafters. The air smelled of earth and old secrets. The team searched for days, cataloging inscriptions, lifting fallen stones, documenting patterns carved into walls. At first, they found nothing unusual. But then, on the third night, as the moon cast silver light across the broken altar, one of the linguists noticed something odd. Behind the altar was a panel of stone carved with symbols. Not crosses, not saints, but stars intertwined with spirals identical to the ones Valerius had seen centuries before in the Forgotten Kingdom. Some of the symbols matched those found in the papal fragment. A shiver passed through the group. They pushed the panel aside. Behind it was a narrow corridor, hidden, dark, and cold. The archaeologist lit a lantern and stepped inside. The air smelled ancient, undisturbed. At the far end of the corridor, sealed beneath a layer of plaster, was a stack of small wooden cases. Most had rotted, their contents lost. But one remained intact, wrapped in oilcloth, protected by careful hands long dead. The archaeologist lifted it with trembling fingers. Inside was a journal. Its pages were brittle, its writing dense and hurried. The first line made the scholars gasp aloud. Year of our Lord 1237. I, Brother Matthew of Languedoc, record these words to preserve the truth they will destroy. The journal told a story that echoed the papal fragment. According to Brother Matthew, a group of refugee families had arrived in Languedoc generations earlier, carrying with them a secret heritage from the Holy Land of Judea. They were protected by sympathetic monks, given new names, and woven quietly into the fabric of Cathar communities. They were the line of witnesses. Brother Matthew's writings described their rituals, their symbols, their careful efforts to remain hidden. But he also wrote of danger. Agents of the church searching for them, bishops ordering silent hunts, inquisitors who burned entire villages while shouting accusations of heresy. Matthew's final entry was the most chilling. There is one family left, one child. If Rome finds him, the blood of the witness will end. I hide these writings for those who will come after, for those who will understand what is at stake. The scholars stared at the journal in stunned silence. The evidence was overwhelming. A papal fragment had led them to a forgotten monk's testimony. Two accounts separated by centuries, yet telling the same story. A lineage, a bloodline, a child. The historian clutched the journal to his chest. The Pope died for knowing this, he whispered. And someone in the church killed him, another replied. The team left the monastery before sunrise, carrying the journal and the papal fragment with them. They knew they had awakened something dangerous. They knew eyes would be watching. They knew their discovery would shake the foundation of the church if made public. But they also knew the truth could not remain buried forever. For centuries, the Vatican had suppressed hints of the lineage. But now, through a torn page and a forgotten monk's testimony, the past had resurfaced, and it pointed directly to the mountains of southern France, where the Cathars once lived, where a child once hid, where the next revelation waited. The Cathars were unlike any people the church had ever encountered. They lived simply, spoke gently, and believed in a purity of spirit that bypassed the rigid hierarchies of Rome. To the world, they were heretics. To themselves, they were keepers of an ancient truth, a truth that made them enemies of those who claimed absolute authority. For generations, the Cathars welcomed wanderers into their communities. Farmers fleeing war, scholars running from censorship, families escaping the church's silent reach. Among those refugees were people carrying a secret heritage older than any European tradition. They arrived without heraldry, without wealth, without identity except for the quiet fire inside them, the knowledge of a bloodline that could never be spoken aloud. The Cathars recognized something unusual in these exiles. They saw it not in their clothes or their behavior, but in their eyes, eyes that held generations of persecution and survival. Without asking questions, they offered them shelter in their stone villages perched high in the Pyrenees. They shared their bread, their homes, their prayers. It was here that the descendants of the witness found safety for the first time since fleeing Rome. But safety never lasts. The church had long despised the Cathars, declaring their beliefs dangerous, their gatherings seditious, their simplicity a threat to the pomp of ecclesiastical authority. Yet beneath the official reasons for the Albigensian Crusade, the war Rome launched against them, something darker lingered. A suspicion, a whispered rumor inside the Vatican's cold chambers, that the Cathars were hiding families connected to the forbidden genealogy, that within their mountain refuges might live the living descendants of a lineage Rome was determined to erase. The crusade began under the guise of eradicating heresy, but the brutality that followed was far greater than theological disagreement. Entire villages were slaughtered, women and children burned alive, fields left to rot. The church's soldiers marched through Languedoc with a fervor that seemed disproportionate, even for a holy war. Some historians believe the church was searching for someone. Not a Cathar leader, not a rebel knight, a child descended from the witness. Brother Matthew's journal hinted at this possibility, describing how rumors reached the Qatar fortresses that men in cloaks of crimson were asking specifically about families recently arrived from Italy, families whose names did not appear in local records. The Cathars understood immediately. They hid the families deep in the mountains, constructing labyrinth-like paths only they could navigate. They sheltered them in caves carved into cliff faces, behind waterfalls, inside abandoned towers. They taught the children new names, new languages, new stories, anything to obscure their true origins. But no matter how well they hid, the church pressed closer. Rumors spread of interrogations, of informants, of soldiers who raided homes searching for a child described only as marked by heaven. Some Cathars resisted openly, defending their homes with slings and stones. Others fled, scattering into the forests. But even as they fled, they kept the hidden families safe, moving them from refuge to refuge under the cover of darkness. Eventually, the Crusaders reached the greatest of the Qatar strongholds, the fortress of Montsegur, perched atop a sheer cliff that rose like a dagger into the sky. It was said the fortress was impenetrable, built by hands guided by prophecy. Inside its walls lived not only Qatar leaders but refugees, scholars, storytellers, keepers of genealogy. Some carried scrolls, others carried secrets, and among them were those who bore the bloodline of the witness. For 10 months the fortress held against siege. Supplies dwindled, hope thinned, but still the defenders refused to surrender the families entrusted to them. The surviving manuscripts describe how, on the final night before Montsegur fell, Qatar guardians smuggled a single family, a man, a woman, and a child, down a hidden path carved into the cliff face. They vanished into the night, carrying with them a scroll that contained part of the forbidden genealogy. The child was never identified by name, but Brother Matthew's journal called him the last branch. The next morning, when the fortress finally surrendered, more than 200 Cathars refused to renounce their faith and were burned alive in a mass pyre. It was one of history's darkest moments, a flame meant to consume both faith and bloodline. Yet even as the fire raged, soldiers whispered among themselves, "Where is the child? We cannot find the child. We must find the child." Hundreds died, but the one they sought slipped away. The escape of that family ignited panic inside certain church circles. Secret letters flew between bishops, describing an unacceptable failure and ordering the immediate pursuit of the survivors. Troops scoured the mountains. Trails grew cold. Snowstorms erased footprints. And always the Cathars, those who remained, misled the searchers. "The child went east," they said. "He boarded a ship," others lied. "He perished in the mountains," another group insisted. But no one told the truth, because no one knew. The family disappeared so completely that even the Cathars themselves believed they might have died. Only Brother Matthew seemed certain they had survived. He wrote, "They carry the blood that kings once feared. They carry the truth Rome could not bear. They shall not be caught." His words, written in a hidden corridor and buried for centuries, confirmed what the papal fragment had implied. The Church's attack on the Cathars was not only a crusade against heresy. It was a hunt, a desperate attempt to extinguish a lineage that threatened to expose the Church's earliest sins. Generations later, when historians examined the timelines, they noticed something extraordinary. After the fall of the Cathars, families with mysterious origins suddenly appeared across the Pyrenees. Villagers with Judean features, uncommon names, and oral traditions that hinted at ancient ancestry. They integrated with local communities but held onto a few quiet customs. Star-shaped carvings over doorways, stories of an ancestor who crossed mountains under pursuit, an aversion to speaking with priests in red vestments. Most dismissed these as folklore, but the symbols matched the ones found in the Judean tomb. The stories matched the monks' journals. The blood, when tested centuries later, held markers linked unmistakably to Middle Eastern ancestry. The Cathars had sheltered the bloodline. They had protected it until their last breath. And even after their destruction, the lineage lived, scattered, hidden, waiting. In the ashes of a faith burned by Rome, a secret survived. Not a belief, not a doctrine, a child. A child whose descendants would one day rise from obscurity and bring the truth back into the light. The Pyrenees are a strange place at dawn. The mountains seem to breathe, exhaling mist that rolls down their slopes like ancient spirits whispering to each other. Cold wind sweeps through the valleys with a voice that sounds almost human, as if the stones themselves remember every footstep ever taken across their paths. Every battle, every escape, every secret. It was into this landscape that the surviving family fled. After the fall of Montségur, guided by the night and shielded by the loyalty of dying Cathars, they vanished into the jagged wilderness, carrying a scroll wrapped in oilcloth and the last remnants of a bloodline Rome had tried relentlessly to extinguish. With them was a child, small, frightened, but possessing a quiet determination inherited from generations who had carried the same burden. They were not alone. The Pyrenees had long been a refuge for the displaced. Shepherds, mystics, deserters, and those fleeing the church's inquisitors hid in its forests and caves. It was among these exiles that the family found shelter. They were welcomed not with questions but with food, blankets, and silence, the kind of silence that understands without explanation. For weeks, they lived in hidden huts built into cliffsides, invisible from the paths below. The family learned the ways of the shepherd clans, how to navigate mountain ridges without leaving tracks, how to mask smoke from a fire, how to blend into the rhythm of the land. The child listened carefully, memorizing every instruction, because survival depended on memory. Every night, the father unfolded the secret scroll, its ink shimmering faintly in the firelight. It contained only fragments of the forbidden genealogy, names, symbols, lines connecting ancestors to the witness. He traced them slowly, reverently. The child watched him do this so many times that he could recall the names even in dreams. But danger pressed closer. Church patrols began scouring the mountains, searching not for Cathar rebels but for a family bearing the mark of the old inheritance. They interrogated shepherds, bribed guides, burned huts. They traveled along ridges with torches held high, hoping to catch movement in the dark. And so, under the cover of one moonless night, the family, guided by a shepherd woman named Yenera, crossed deeper into the mountains. Yenera knew hidden trails carved by smugglers and rebels. She walked barefoot, listening to the earth, sensing danger before it appeared. She led them through ravines so narrow they had to turn sideways to pass, across icy rivers that swallowed sound, and over bridges of stone laid centuries before by hands unknown. The child never cried, even when wind cut his face and cold numbed his fingers. His silence frightened his mother, but Yenera shook her head. "He carries too much," she whispered. "Children who bear secrets learn quiet early." Eventually, after days of relentless climbing, they reached a secluded valley where a small community of refugees lived in harmony with the harsh land. They built huts from branches and clay, grew small gardens, and herded goats. They called themselves the Mountain Folk, though their true origins spanned dozens of villages burned by Rome. When the family arrived, the Mountain Folk saw the signs: the star-shaped carving on the father's pendant, the spiral charm on the mother's wrist, the quiet determination in the child's eyes. They recognized these symbols not because they knew their full meaning, but because they had seen them before in other wanderers who carried ancient legacies. The family was given a hut, food, and anonymity. Time slipped by. The child grew stronger. He learned to climb like a mountain goat, to run across rocks without slipping, to read the sky before storms rolled in. The Mountain Folk taught him old songs that traced their roots back to forgotten Judean melodies. They did not know the song's origins, only that they had been passed from wanderers to wanderers, surviving like ghosts in the wind. But no matter how far the family fled, the past followed. One evening, a group of exhausted travelers reached the valley, fleeing from inquisitors. Among them was a scholar who carried with him an object wrapped in red cloth. He said he had retrieved it from a Cathar refuge before it was destroyed. When he unwrapped it, the family gasped. It was a wooden tablet engraved with the same symbols found in the Judean tomb, symbols connecting two branches of the bloodline. The scholar whispered, "They were not searching for a scroll. They were searching for you. Both branches still live. But the church does not know where. This revelation shook the valley. 2 branches. 2 surviving lines. 2 families scattered across the world. The mountain folk began to fear the weight of the secret they protected. If the church ever learned the child was here, soldiers would raze the valley, leaving no one alive. And so the family faced a terrible choice. Stay hidden and risk discovery, or move even deeper into exile. They chose exile. At dawn, the mountain folk gathered to say farewell. Yenera handed the mother a leather pouch filled with crushed herbs for healing. The scholar gave the father a second scroll fragment, matching the one he already carried. And an elderly shepherd placed a carved stone into the child's hand. A star split into 2 pieces. "Remember this," he said gently. "You are not alone. Somewhere in this world, someone carries the same blood as you." The child nodded, absorbing the words with the solemnity of someone far older than his years. With heavy hearts, the family departed the valley. They followed a narrow trail that led through thick forests and across hidden plateaus. Snow fell softly around them, coating branches and footprints alike. The mountains seemed to mourn their departure. But destiny had no room for stillness. As they descended into a new valley on the other side of the Pyrenees, they encountered a group of travelers who spoke a dialect the family did not recognize, but who wore necklaces marked with symbols the child did. They were another line of refugees, distant cousins of a lineage forgotten by history. The families exchanged stories in broken language, piecing together fragments of ancient memory. Their ancestors had fled not through France but through Spain. They had crossed deserts, forests, and coasts, always staying one step ahead of Rome's relentless pursuit. 2 branches meeting for the first time. The child looked at one of the travelers, a girl about his age. She wore a carved pendant identical to his, and she smiled at him with eyes that held the same quiet fire. It was then the family understood. The bloodline was larger than they had ever imagined. It had not survived by accident. It had survived through faith, secrecy, sacrifice, and an unbreakable determination passed from one generation to the next. As night settled over the valley, the stars shone brighter than they ever had before. The child looked up, clutching the stone carved with the divided star. 2 branches, 1 legacy. The world would never understand the depth of what lived within their blood. But the mountains understood, and they would protect the secret until the world was ready. Centuries passed, but symbols have a strange way of surviving even when memories fade. They cling to stone, to wood, to manuscripts hidden in dusty corners of forgotten monasteries. And sometimes they cling to the very architecture meant to suppress them. That irony lay at the heart of the next revelation, the discovery that the forbidden lineage had left fingerprints not only on remote kingdoms and mountain tribes, but within the Vatican itself. It began with patterns. Scholars studying medieval heraldry often dismissed strange symbols as regional flourishes, artistic embellishments, or miscopied designs. But one historian, an expert in early Christian iconography, noticed something odd while examining the coats of arms belonging to several medieval popes and cardinals. Many of these emblems featured unmistakable variations of the elongated star, the same star found in the Judean tomb, the same star carved into the Forgotten Kingdom's ruins, the same star worn by the child who had fled Rome centuries earlier. At first, she thought it was coincidence. But coincidences lose their innocence when repeated too many times. She expanded her research. Instead of studying only papal heraldry, she began cataloging symbols found in ancient churches, carved into baptismal fonts, mosaics, and ceremonial staffs. The deeper she looked, the more frequent the pattern became. The elongated star appeared in places it had no business appearing. In cathedrals built by architects who supposedly knew nothing of Judean iconography. In stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes where the symbol did not belong. These were not accidents. Someone had placed them intentionally. And then she discovered something even stranger. Several early Vatican seals included the star hidden within the design. It was subtle, worked into the folds of robes, tucked into the corners of parchment stamps, disguised as ornamental flourishes. But once she knew what to look for, she saw it everywhere. When she presented her findings to fellow historians, half dismissed her theory as overinterpretation. The other half urged her to keep digging. But digging in Vatican history is never safe. She found herself drawn to one symbol in particular, a star inscribed within a wreath of olive branches. It appeared on a few medieval documents connected to a group of clerics known for their secrecy. These clerics served in a little-known office whose records had been mostly destroyed, the Officium Custodii Antiquitatis, the Office for the Guarding of Antiquity. They had operated quietly for centuries, preserving artifacts deemed too dangerous or controversial for the public. But one surviving note from the 1400s mentioned that their primary duty was custodiare sanguinem vitissimum, to guard the oldest blood. Blood, not relics, not books, blood. The phrasing struck her like lightning. She looked again at their emblem. The star was not decorative. It was a marker, a sign used by members of the forbidden bloodline and by those who had sworn to protect it. The historian realized with a jolt that some of these clerics might not have been merely guardians. Some may have been descendants themselves, survivors who quietly integrated into church structures, hiding in plain sight, shaping policies from within while ensuring their origins remained invisible. A bloodline surviving inside the very institution sworn to erase it. If true, the implications were staggering. To confirm her suspicions, she turned to architecture, the silent witness that never lies. Romanesque churches built during the height of the church's suppression efforts bore carvings that matched the forbidden symbols exactly. Not only stars but spirals, divided crescents, and intertwined branches, each of which appeared on the genealogical artifacts tied to the witness. She visited one cathedral in northern Italy. Its front doors were made of bronze, adorned with biblical scenes, but carved discreetly into the frame were tiny, almost invisible star symbols no larger than a fingernail. She found the same stars on pillars inside the nave, on the base of the altar, on the underside of a bishop's chair. Hidden everywhere, unnoticed by worshippers for nearly 1,000 years. Another church, this one in southern France, held a stone baptismal font decorated with vines and leaves. Embedded between the vines was a star with elongated points. When she compared it to her research notes, it matched the emblem from the Judean burial chamber with near-perfect accuracy. And then she found the most startling evidence of all. In a vault beneath a monastery in Umbria, documents sealed since the 1500s, she discovered sketches attributed to a little-known architect who worked on several Vatican buildings. In the margins of his plans, he had drawn variations of the elongated star. Next to one sketch he wrote, "Per memoria di coloro che venero prima," for the memory of those who came before. Why would an architect working for the Vatican include such a line? Why would he honor a lineage the Church supposedly never acknowledged? Unless someone inside the Vatican had instructed him. Unless someone wanted the memory preserved, not erased. Unless the bloodline's influence had reached places far deeper and far more audacious than historians had ever imagined. The historian's hands shook as she leafed through the architect's notes. There were diagrams of symbols incorporated into columns, altarpieces, vaulted ceilings. He had woven the forbidden language of the bloodline into the very bones of the buildings. Hidden in shadowed corners, disguised as decorative geometry, indistinguishable unless one knew exactly what to look for. A secret built into stone. A memory carved into architecture. A message left for those who still carried the ancient blood. But the moment she realized the scope of her discovery, fear crept in. A quiet, suffocating fear. Because if she had found this, others, those who wished to keep the truth buried, would not be far behind. Her colleagues noticed her growing paranoia. She began locking her notes in a safe. She stopped responding to emails. She canceled lectures. But it wasn't until she found her office door ajar one morning, papers shuffled, books slightly displaced, that she understood fully. She was being watched, just like the families in the Pyrenees, just like the monks who protected the genealogy, just like Pope Lucianus before he died. The symbols in Catholic architecture were not simply relics of forgotten craftsmanship. They were warnings, breadcrumbs, echoes placed by those who wanted the truth to survive even if they did not. And now someone had followed those echoes back to her. She stared at her research, hundreds of photos, sketches, comparisons, and felt the weight of history pressing on her chest. The line of the witness had not only survived. It had left its signature carved into the Vatican itself. The question was no longer who had hidden the truth. It was who was protecting it now. The Vatican's secret archives were never truly secret, at least not in the way legends imagined them. Scholars knew they existed. Priests spoke of them with reverence. Officials insisted they were simply a repository of history too delicate for casual eyes. But those who walked the marble hallways of the Apostolic Palace knew the truth. These archives were not built to store the past. They were built to control it. Beneath the Vatican, past guarded entrances and behind doors that required keys forged centuries ago, lay kilometers of shelves containing correspondence, state secrets, excommunications, coded letters, and documents that had shaped the fate of empires. Some were mundane, some were dangerous, and some were lethal to the Church's carefully crafted narrative. It was here, among these labyrinthine corridors, that the historian found herself, reluctantly, fearfully. After months of tracing forbidden symbols woven into the architecture of cathedrals and Vatican heraldry, summoned, not invited, no explanation provided, only a letter stamped with an ornate seal requesting her presence at the private archives. When she arrived, a young priest escorted her through corridors lit by cold electric lights. The deeper they walked, the more oppressive the air became. Dust hung thick. Silence settled like a shroud. It felt less like an archive and more like an underworld, a place where truth went to die. The priest stopped before a carved wooden door adorned with an emblem she recognized instantly: the elongated star. Her breath caught. She had only seen that symbol hidden in architecture, tucked into margins of forgotten manuscripts. Here it stood boldly on a Vatican door. Inside, the priest said, avoiding her eyes. She entered the chamber. It was smaller than she expected, an intimate study lined with shelves, each filled with bound volumes wrapped in leather darkened by age. But the most striking feature was the desk at the center. Upon it rested a single box, carved from black wood, etched with the same star that had followed her through her entire research journey. Cardinal sat behind the desk. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. "We've been watching your work," he said without greeting. His voice echoed off the stone walls. "You see patterns most overlook." She froze. Her mind raced. They know. All of it. Every photograph, every note, every architectural comparison. The cardinal gestured to the box. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay documents older than anything she had ever seen. Scrolls written on parchment so fragile they looked ready to crumble. Beneath them were sealed letters bound with wax. And beneath those, wrapped in linen, was an object that made her breath hitch in her throat. A bronze pendant shaped like the elongated star. She lifted it carefully. It was cold, so cold it seemed to pulse in her palm. "This comes from a tomb uncovered centuries ago," the cardinal said. "The same symbol you've traced through Europe." She stared at him. "Why are you showing me this?" The cardinal's expression hardened. "Because you are approaching truths that should remain buried." She felt the room tilt slightly. She tried to steady herself. "Why? What is the Church so afraid of?" He leaned forward, hands clasped. "Blood," he whispered. "Blood older than the papacy. Blood that carries a story we did not write." Her heart pounded. She remembered the forbidden genealogies, the hidden symbol in the tomb, the journal of Brother Matthew, the Qatar refuge. "You knew the lineage survived," she said. He said nothing, but the silence was an answer. The historian stepped back, clutching the bronze pendant. Her voice was barely audible. "How long have you been hiding this?" The cardinal's jaw tightened. "Since the first schisms. Since Rome understood that truth can divide more sharply than heresy." She felt a surge of anger. "And you buried it, killed for it." His eyes flickered with regret, or perhaps warning. "History is delicate," he said softly. "Faith even more so. Some truths heal, others destroy. The Church chose preservation over chaos." And what about the families who carried the bloodline? She pressed. What about the people hunted, displaced, erased? The cardinal closed his eyes for a moment. We could not allow the world to follow a lineage instead of a faith. She was shaking now. So the solution was to hunt them? He opened his eyes. The coldness had returned. Our predecessors believed it necessary. We are not proud of it. Her voice cracked. There are two branches. That startled him. You know this. I found the symbol, she said. The divided star. The cardinal rose from his seat. His shadow stretched long across the stone floor. Then you understand the danger. If the world learns the church hid an unbroken bloodline tied to the origins of Christianity, one preserved through exile, secrecy, and the sacrifice of thousands, everything collapses. The air thickened. The lamp flickered. Then he did something unexpected. He walked to a shelf, pulled down a worn leather volume, and placed it before her. It was titled Genealogia Obscura. Her breath stopped. The mythical book she'd heard whispered about in academic circles. A book that supposedly contained forbidden genealogies suppressed by the church. Scholars claimed it never existed. The Vatican claimed it was a medieval conspiracy. And yet here it was. She opened the cover. The first page contained familiar symbols. Stars, spirals, branches, forming a tree unlike any she had seen. Lines connected continents, names, families across time. Some names were faded, others violently scratched out. The more she turned the pages, the more her pulse quickened. This was not just a record. It was evidence. Evidence that the forbidden bloodline had been known, tracked, followed, feared. For more than 1,000 years. She closed the book with trembling hands. Why show me this? She whispered. The cardinal stepped back, his face unreadable. Because you are not the only one searching. Others, less careful, more ambitious, have begun piecing together the fragments. If they find the truth without context, they will exploit it, weaponize it, turn lineage into authority. And what do you expect me to do? She asked. He walked toward the door, placing his hand on the carved, elongated star. Decide whether the world is ready, he said, and whether you are. Then he stepped outside, leaving her alone with the book, the pendant, and a truth that could unravel the foundations of both faith and history. She felt the room closing in around her. The shelves, the stone walls, the lamplight. They all seemed to lean closer, as if urging her to choose. Expose the truth, or protect the fragile balance that held civilization together. She lifted the pendant once more, feeling its weight, its coldness, its undeniable significance. Somewhere in the world, descendants of the witness still lived. Somewhere, families carried the blood of a story buried but not forgotten. And now she held the key to unearthing it all. Above her, in the world of sunlight and prayer, the Vatican carried on in silence. Below, in the dim chamber lit by a single flickering lamp, a lineage waited to be brought into the light. The cardinal who had shown her the Genealogia Obscura did not summon her again. After their strange, unsettling meeting, he vanished from her world as swiftly as he had appeared. His office door was always locked, his nameplate removed. His assistants claimed he had been reassigned. Others whispered he had fallen ill. But she sensed the truth. The Vatican had drawn him back into its quiet machinery, silencing a voice that had momentarily drifted off script. Days passed, then weeks. She waited for a message, a warning, a sign. Nothing came. But one evening, as she walked home through the dim, cobbled streets of Rome, she heard footsteps behind her, soft, measured, deliberate. She turned, heart pounding, but the alley was empty. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision made her quicken her pace. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment door and bolted it behind her. Only when she stepped inside did she see the envelope on her table. Placed neatly, impossible to miss, though she was certain it hadn't been there when she left. Her breath froze. She approached slowly, as if the envelope itself might strike. The wax seal bore a symbol she recognized instantly. The elongated star, pressed cleanly into dark red wax. Her hands shook as she broke it open. Inside was a letter written in a shaky, almost trembling hand. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It belonged to the cardinal. He had risked everything to write this. I do not have long. They are watching me, watching all who touch the old truth. But I must tell you one last thing, before silence consumes me. She read faster, her pulse thudding like a drum in her ears. The genealogy you saw was not the only copy. There was another, one I hid long ago when I was still a young man studying in the seminary. I feared the day might come when the truth needed a witness. She felt a chill. Another copy? Where? I hid it in the earth. A place untouched by Rome's hands. A place where silence is older than faith itself. Then came the line that made her sit down suddenly, her legs weak. I buried it, but I was not alone. Someone else had seen. Someone else had helped. Someone else knew. She turned the page. Before he died, the priest who helped me whispered a name, one he claimed belonged to the last surviving line of the witness. A living heir. A living heir. The heir seemed to vanish from the room. She read on. I write this not to expose you to danger, but to prepare you. The truth is not dormant. It breathes. It moves. It waits. And Rome fears that the sleepers may wake. The letter ended abruptly, as though interrupted. The last line was jagged. The ink smeared. If they find the heir first. Nothing more. The page was ripped, torn as if snatched from his hand before he could finish. She sat in silence, staring at the torn edge, her heart thundering. Then she noticed something else inside the envelope. A small, folded slip of paper separate from the cardinal's letter. This one was older, yellowed, worn. When she unfolded it, she gasped. It was a confession, written decades ago, signed in the cardinal's full name. I was a guardian. I was sworn to protect the lineage. And one night, in my youth, I broke the vow. Her stomach twisted. I spoke the truth to a man who should never have heard it. A man whose ambition outweighed his faith. A man who now sits in a position of power far above me. The words blurred as shock tightened her throat. Someone inside the Vatican, someone powerful, knew of the lineage. And this someone was not protecting it. He was hunting it. She read the next line with dread. The heir is alive. But if the wrong hands reach him, the truth will not be revealed. It will be rewritten. She lowered the confession slowly, her breath shallow. She understood now why the cardinal had been silenced. Why he had vanished. Why her research had drawn attention. This was not simply history. It was a battlefield. And she had stepped directly into the center of it. She searched the envelope again and found something small at the bottom. A tiny metal token, no larger than a coin. It carried the same star symbol, but bisected down the middle, identical to the fractured star found in the tomb. Two halves. Two branches. She understood the message. This token represented the part of the lineage the cardinal had tracked. The other half, its twin, was somewhere else in the world, carried by someone who had no idea what lived within their blood. The historian stood, gripping the token tightly. She needed answers. She left her apartment immediately and hurried through the narrow streets to the only place that still held a shred of hope. The small research room inside the Vatican library where she had first been allowed to study old manuscripts. She hoped to find the cardinal. Or clues. Or something. But when she arrived, the door was sealed. Two guards stood outside. When she approached, one stepped forward. The archives are closed for tonight. She tried to keep her voice steady. I'm expected. By whom? She hesitated. She could not say the cardinal's name. The guard's expression hardened. Leave now. She stepped back, fear coiling in her stomach like a serpent. As she turned away, she caught sight of a shadow moving behind the frosted glass of the archive door. A figure watching her, following her. She hurried out of the Vatican and into the night. Standing beneath the glow of a street lamp, she clutched the metal token and the cardinal's torn confession. The truth was no longer a mystery to be studied in libraries. It was alive. It was moving. It was hunted. Just like the families in the Pyrenees. Just like the witness's child. Just like every keeper of the lineage who had ever tried to survive. She closed her eyes and whispered into the cold Roman night, Where are you? Somewhere. A living air breathed in ignorance of the danger rising around him. And now she was the only one who knew he existed. The only one who could find him before Rome did. The only one who could unravel the secret the cardinal had paid for with his life. She slipped the token into her pocket and disappeared into the dark streets. The hunt for the last branch had begun. The excavation site lay on the outskirts of Rome, beneath a lonely stretch of hillside that shepherds avoided and locals spoke of only in whispers. They called it La Collina del Ombre, the Hill of Shadows. Legends claimed the ground beneath it held remnants of an ancient settlement destroyed before Rome's rise to glory. Others said the hill concealed tunnels carved by early Christians fleeing persecution. But no one knew for certain. It was the kind of place whose silence felt intentional, as though the earth itself were guarding something. For years, archaeologists petitioned to dig there, and for years they were denied. Then, without explanation, the Vatican quietly approved an excavation, under strict supervision, with limited access, and an agreement that any discovery of religious significance would be reported directly to church authorities. It was an odd directive. Most archaeological digs welcomed scholars, transparency, media interest. This one welcomed nothing. The historian, clutching the cardinal's final notes, realized this was no coincidence. Someone in the Vatican wanted to control what was found beneath the hill. Someone feared what might be revealed. When she arrived at the excavation site, the sky was heavy with clouds, threatening rain. Tents clustered at the base of the hill, filled with tools, lights, and crates of pottery shards. But a deeper unease lingered in the air. Workers spoke in hushed tones. Guards patrolled the perimeter. And at the far end of the field, a metal staircase descended into a narrow trench that cut deep into the side of the hill. She approached the lead archaeologist, Dr. Rinaldi, a man known for brilliance matched only by his caution. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Fear? She wasn't sure. "I received your message," he muttered, wiping dirt from his gloves. "But you shouldn't have come. I need to see what you found." He hesitated, glancing toward the guards. "This site, it's not like others. The Vatican visits almost daily." "That's why I'm here," she said quietly. "This isn't just history. It's connected to something I've been studying." Rinaldi sighed and motioned for her to follow. They descended the metal steps into the trench. The earth walls rose high around them, layered with centuries of sediment. At the bottom, a cavern opened into darkness, illuminated by lanterns hung from the scaffolding. The historian shivered. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. Rinaldi handed her a flashlight. "Stay close. The passage narrows ahead." They ducked through a low archway and entered a long chamber carved directly into the hillside. The walls bore faint scorch marks, as if torches had burned here long ago. Cobwebs laced across ceiling beams. Dust lay thick on the floor. "This isn't Roman," Rinaldi whispered. "It predates the city." She examined the carvings. Faint symbols stretched across the walls, branches, circles, star-like shapes. Her heart hammered. These were the same symbols found on the Judean tomb. The same symbols hidden in Vatican architecture. The same symbols marking the bloodline. They moved deeper. The tunnel widened into a circular room with a dirt floor and stone shelves carved into the walls. On those shelves sat clay jars, sealed with hardened resin. Some were cracked. Others remained intact. Rinaldi approached one of them with visible reverence. "This is what triggered the Vatican's interest," he said. "We found these jars buried beneath a collapsed altar." He carefully lifted a jar and placed it on a flat stone. "Open it," she whispered. He cracked the resin with a metal pick. Dust drifted upward as he pried the lid loose. Inside were fragments of vellum, so old they seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Rinaldi separated the pieces gently. Words appeared, faded but still legible. The historian leaned closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a genealogy. Not Roman, not medieval. Older, written in a script resembling early Judean writing, with annotations added in Latin centuries later. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "This This is part of the same lineage I've been tracing. Rinaldi looked shaken. There's more. Much more. He led her to another jar, larger, sealed with layers of clay and wax. It had been placed at the center of the room, as though given special importance. The jar bore a carved lid with the divided star, two halves facing opposite directions. Her stomach twisted, the symbol of the two branches. Rinaldi opened it. This time, instead of fragments, the jar held a rolled scroll, remarkably intact, protected by careful preservation. He unrolled it slowly on a flat wooden board. The script danced in looping lines across the parchment. Names connected by branches. Family lines rising and falling like mountain ridges. The historian pressed a hand to her mouth. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the original record. The genealogy the Vatican tried to destroy." Rinaldi's hand trembled as he pointed at a name near the bottom. "This person, this must be the child you told me about, the one who fled Rome. The name matches the early Qatar records." She traced the line extending downward. "But look," she whispered. "The line continues. It didn't end. It moved. It branched." At the very bottom of the scroll, a final name had been added in a different hand, newer than the rest. A name neither of them recognized. "Someone updated this centuries after it was written," Rinaldi said. "Someone wanted the lineage to be traceable." The historian felt her pulse pounding. There was more. At the edge of the scroll, written in faint Latin, were words that chilled her. "Buried beneath the hill until the witness returns." Rinaldi looked at her, pale. "What does that mean?" "It means this place wasn't a burial site." Her voice shook. "It was a vault for truth, a vault for survival, a vault meant to protect the lineage until the world was ready." They stepped back, absorbing the gravity of the find. Then Rinaldi whispered, "There's something else." He led her to another corner of the chamber where a stone slab lay partially unearthed. It bore markings identical to the tomb in the Forgotten Kingdom. Beneath the slab, he believed, might be a reliquary. But before they could lift it, heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnel. The historian and Rinaldi froze. Voices approached, low, stern, authoritative. "They're here," Rinaldi whispered. "The Vatican sent them." She grabbed the scroll, rolling it quickly and tucking it inside her coat. Rinaldi looked terrified. "If they find it—" "They won't," she said, gripping his arm. "But we have to leave. Now." They extinguished the lanterns and slipped into a narrow side passage just as 3 Vatican officials entered the chamber. Their flashlights swept across the walls, illuminating the jars, the stone shelves, the exposed archaeology. One of them said, "Seal the site. No one enters without explicit authorization." Another replied, "And find the missing jar. Someone has been here." The historian and Rinaldi waited in absolute darkness, hearts pounding, until the voices faded. When they finally emerged into the evening air, the first drops of rain began to fall. The scroll pressed against her chest felt like a heartbeat, alive, essential, dangerous. She looked at Rinaldi. "We found what they feared, and they know someone has it." He swallowed hard. "What now?" She turned her eyes toward the distant lights of Rome. "Now," she whispered, "we find the air before they do." The scroll she had taken from the hill felt heavier with every passing hour, as though the ink itself resisted the burden of daylight. She kept it pressed against her chest inside her coat, afraid even to breathe too close to it. Something about the ancient vellum radiated a kind of quiet power, a presence that made her acutely aware she was no longer just studying history. She was carrying it, carrying people, carrying names that had been erased, chased, hunted, scattered like seeds across continents. She reached her apartment in Rome just before dawn. The city was still asleep, the cobblestones wet from the night's rain. She locked every bolt, closed the curtains, and finally unwrapped the scroll. She spread it out across her table, hands trembling. Candlelight cast wavering shadows across the parchment. The genealogy was unlike anything she had seen before. It did not resemble the rigid charts used by medieval scribes. It flowed, branches spiraling outward, lines weaving between names like living vines. It looked less like a document and more like a map of blood, memory, and movement. Every name was a destination. Every line was a journey. Her eyes moved down the scroll slowly, reverently. Here were the names preserved in the hidden tomb, the ancestors who fled Judea, who built kingdoms in exile, who carried symbols across mountains and oceans. Here were the names from Brother Matthew's writings, the families sheltered by the Cathars, the children smuggled out of besieged fortresses, the ones who vanished into the Pyrenees like ghosts. Then she saw the names she had never encountered before. Names scratched out violently, almost angrily. Entire branches blackened with ink. Someone had tried to erase them. Someone had feared what they represented. She leaned closer. Beneath the scratched-out names were faint markings, residue of ink that had not fully faded. With the edge of her fingernail, she gently flaked away the top layer of soot-darkened wax. And there, beneath centuries of deliberate obliteration, she saw it. A line connecting to another. A name still visible if the light struck it at the right angle. Her breath caught. This was one of the lost descendants. A branch Rome thought it had destroyed. A family believed to have been wiped out during the Inquisitions. But their name still lingered here, faint but alive. She exhaled shakily. They survived, she whispered. She continued down the scroll. Names grew fewer as the genealogy approached the modern era. Wars, plagues, migrations, so many forces had thinned the bloodline. But it had not ended, because near the bottom, added in a more recent hand, was the name that had stunned both her and Rinaldi. The name written in ink darker and fresher than all the rest. A name with no scratches, no damage, no attempt to hide it. A name that didn't appear in any church record, any noble family tree, any historical archive. A name that belonged to someone alive. She whispered it aloud. The sound felt electric in the air. She didn't know the person, but the surname was unusual. Foreign, possibly Eastern European, maybe Slavic or Baltic. She grabbed her laptop, typed it into search engines, academic databases, genealogical registries. Nothing. She tried variations, regional spellings, historical migration patterns. Still nothing. It was as though the person existed only on the scroll, or as though their identity had been deliberately obscured. She sat back, rubbing her temples. Why would someone add a name here and nowhere else? It didn't make sense, until she looked again at the ink. The strokes were careful, deliberate, and recent. Someone had updated the scroll with full knowledge of what it was. Someone who knew the bloodline had survived. Someone who wanted future generations to find this descendant. But the Vatican's agents had been coming for the jars. They had been searching for something buried. They must have known the scroll existed. They must have known a surviving name was written on it. Which meant someone inside the church also knew the heir existed. And they were looking for him. She felt her stomach twist. She reached for the magnifying lens on her desk and scanned the lines above the newest name. She hadn't noticed it before, but just above the descendant's entry was a tiny mark. 2 intersecting lines shaped like the divided star discovered in the tomb. Her pulse quickened. This was not just a name. It was a location marker. The split star indicated the branch. The style of the symbol indicated region. She remembered the cardinal's token, the one with the fractured star, and how he had pressed it into her palm before disappearing. The 2 halves represented 2 surviving lines. One line belonged to the families fleeing through Italy, France, and the Pyrenees. The other must have traveled elsewhere. Eastward, perhaps beyond Rome's influence, into lands too vast and fractured for the church to control. She stared at the scroll. That last name, dark, crisp, modern, belonged to the Eastern branch. Her heart beat harder. She translated the surrounding annotations, notes written in Latin and another language she couldn't immediately identify. One phrase repeated itself several times near the bottom. Custos vivit. The guardian lives. Her throat tightened. Not just a descendant. Not just a survivor. A guardian. Someone who unknowingly carried the weight of thousands of years. Someone whose ancestry had been protected, hidden, pushed into obscurity so completely that even Google could not find them. She reached for her phone to call Rinaldi, to tell him this was bigger than they realized. When she froze, her phone screen flickered. A notification. Unknown device has accessed your cloud notes. Her blood turned cold. Then, a second notification. Suspicious login attempt blocked. Location: Vatican City. Her hand began to shake. They were watching. They had found her. They knew she had the scroll. A sudden knock on her door shattered the silence. 3 sharp raps. Firm. Authoritative. Her breath hitched. Another knock. Louder. Insistent. She looked at the scroll, spread vulnerably across her table. She needed to hide it. Now, the knocking grew more aggressive. She rolled the scroll with shaking hands and shoved it inside a metal tube used for transporting blueprints. She locked the ends, strapped it across her back, and scanned the room for an escape. Then, a voice outside the door. Calm. Controlled. Cold. Open the door, Signora. We need to speak with you. She backed toward the fire escape window. They knocked again. Harder. We know what you took from the excavation site. Her breath turned into a whisper. Not today. She opened the window, climbed onto the metal fire escape, and descended into the alley behind her building. Her heart hammering as she clutched the tube to her chest. When her feet hit the pavement, she looked back. A silhouette appeared against her apartment's frosted window. A Vatican agent. He turned his head toward the fire escape. She ran. Into the dark streets of Rome. Into the unknown. Into the next chapter of a story written in blood, hidden in shadows, and now, finally, awakening. Because the names they tried to erase had found her. And she was not about to let them disappear again. Night swallowed her as she fled through the narrow Roman alleys, each turn feeling as though it pushed her deeper into a labyrinth designed centuries before she was born. The tube containing the scroll slammed against her hip with every step. She held it tightly, fearing that if she loosened her grip even for a second, the truth inside it would slip away from her, or into the hands of those who hunted her. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then in cold sheets that blurred the yellow glow of street lamps. The cobblestones grew slick. Her breath formed frantic clouds in the air. Behind her, footsteps echoed, steady, composed, frighteningly close. She ducked into a side street, a dead end. Her heart lurched. She spun around, ready to run back the way she came, when a tall figure stepped into view. Black coat, umbrella, face shadowed. He didn't shout, didn't move toward her. He just stood there, blocking her path. Her pulse roared in her ears. She backed against the wet stone wall, clutching the tube protectively. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man's voice was calm. "You need to stop running." Her fingernails dug into the metal tube. "Stay away." The man took one slow step forward. "You have something that belongs to the Vatican." She swallowed. "It doesn't belong to you." Another step. A shadow crossed his face, revealing only the gleam of his eyes beneath the street lamp. "You don't understand the danger. You were never meant to see that scroll." She fought the panic rising in her throat. "I know exactly what I saw." "You know fragments," he said coldly. "Fragments can be deadly." The rain intensified, hammering the pavement. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the man fully. For a heartbeat, she saw the emblem stitched subtly onto his lapel. A symbol she had seen once on a forbidden page in the secret archives. A dagger wrapped in vines. The mark of the Vatican's internal enforcers. The Inquisitio Nova. She stumbled backward. "I won't go with you." His shoulders tightened. "Then I'm afraid." He stepped toward her. But before he could finish his sentence, a shock wave of blinding headlights poured into the alley. A car screeched to a halt, nearly hitting the man. The driver's door slammed open. "Get in!" a voice shouted. She recognized it instantly. Rinaldi. The agent turned sharply toward the car, but she didn't wait. She sprinted past him, slipping on wet cobblestones, her lungs burning. She threw herself into the passenger seat and slammed the door. "Go!" she shouted. Rinaldi hit the accelerator before the door fully closed. The tires screeched, spraying water as the car shot forward. In the rearview mirror, the agent remained standing in the alley, watching them disappear into the storm. Not chasing, not calling for help, just watching, as if he knew the chase had only begun. Rinaldi drove in tense silence until they reached the outskirts of Rome. Finally, he turned sharply onto a gravel road leading into an abandoned industrial district. He parked beneath a rusting metal awning and killed the engine. Only then did he turn to her, soaked, shaking, eyes wild. "What did you do?" he whispered. She held up the metal tube. "I ran." "That's not an answer." She swallowed hard. "They came for me, Rinaldi. They knew I had the scroll. They were at my door." He raked a hand through his wet hair. How could they know so fast? She remembered the message on her phone, the unauthorized access to her cloud files, her notes, her photos. They were monitoring me long before I realized it. Rinaldi leaned over, grabbed the tube from her hands, and opened it. His breath caught when he unrolled the scroll across the dashboard. Raindrops slid down the windshield, creating a distorted reflection of the ancient genealogy. This is impossible," he murmured. "This could upend the entire foundation of church authority." "It's real," she whispered. "Every line, every name." His finger traced the bottom section. "The living heir?" She nodded. "The eastern branch. Someone alive." Rinaldi's expression tightened. "We need to find them." "No," she said. "We need to protect them." Lightning flashed again. The thunder that followed shook the metal awning above them. Rinaldi looked at her, fear deepening in his eyes. "You understand what this means, don't you? If the church believes you've identified the heir, they'll do anything to find him first." She stared at the scroll, at the name that could change everything. "I know." Rinaldi folded the scroll gently and slid it back into the tube. "We can't stay in Rome." "I know. We can't trust anyone." "I know. And if they catch us?" She closed her eyes. "I know." He let out a long, heavy breath. "Then we leave tonight." She nodded, gripping the tube tightly again. "But not blindly." "What do you mean?" "We need to follow the genealogy. The symbols. The notes." Her voice trembled with a mix of terror and determination. "We need to find where the last branch ended." Rinaldi stared at her for a long moment, then whispered, "And where the next one begins." They stepped out of the car. The rain soaked them instantly. The metal tube felt warm against her chest despite the storm. Rinaldi grabbed a small backpack from the trunk and slung it over his shoulder. "Where do we go first?" he asked. She pulled the token from her pocket, the one with the fractured star. Rainwater ran down its surface, making the metal gleam like a tiny shard of moonlight. She turned it over in her palm. A symbol, a direction, a clue left by a dying cardinal. "The star isn't just a mark," she said quietly. "It's a coordinate, a regional symbol. Half the star represents the western branch. The other half, Eastern Europe," Rinaldi said softly, realization dawning. "The Balkans, the Carpathians." She nodded. "That's where we start." A distant engine hummed in the night. She turned sharply. Down the road, two headlights appeared, slow, deliberate, not rushing but approaching with purpose. Rinaldi grabbed her arm. "They found us." She tightened her grip on the scroll. "Then we run now." They darted away from the car and into the maze of abandoned buildings. Rain hammered the metal roofs. Thunder rolled across the sky. Behind them, the headlights grew brighter. She clutched the tube to her chest, whispering the name she had seen on the scroll. A name belonging to someone who didn't yet know they were being hunted. Someone who had no idea the future of a bloodline, the history of a faith, rested on their shoulders. Someone she had to find. Someone she had to save. Before the Vatican did. Before the hunters closed in. Before history was rewritten forever. She ran faster. Into the storm. Into the darkness. Into the next chapter of a story buried, silenced, resurrected. Because now the truth was no longer in ruins or archives. It was in motion, alive, and hunted. They ran until their lungs burned, slipping through puddles, dodging rusted machinery, weaving through skeletal warehouses left to rot decades ago. The storm raged above them, thunder shaking the iron frames of forgotten buildings. Rain hammered everything, cold, relentless, cleansing nothing. Behind them, the car's engine prowled like a predator. Rinaldi grabbed her arm and pointed toward a narrow gap between two collapsed storage units. There, through there. She didn't hesitate. They squeezed through the jagged metal, scraping their clothes and skin, emerging onto an overgrown service road choked with weeds. The dark outlines of freight containers stretched into the distance like silent tombs. "This way," he hissed. They sprinted down the narrow path, their shoes sinking into mud. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sky in violent bursts. In those moments of white-blue clarity, she saw something horrifying. Shadows moving behind them. More than one. Figures sweeping flashlights over the ground, searching for footprints washed away by rain. The Vatican wasn't sending soldiers anymore. They were sending hunters. Rinaldi grabbed her wrist tighter. "We need to reach the river. If we can cross it before they cut us off." Another engine roared. Headlights flared from the opposite end of the road. They were being boxed in. She froze. "Rinaldi, they planned this." He cursed under his breath. "Then we break the plan." The headlights approached, slow and deliberate, like an animal savoring the cornering of its prey. Rain drenched her hair, ran down her face, stung her eyes. The tube containing the scroll banged against her ribs, a reminder of why they were here, why the hunters would not stop. "We go over," Rinaldi said suddenly, pointing to a half-collapsed shipping crane looming over the dark outline of the river. It was rusted, ancient, barely standing, its metal frame groaning with every gust of wind. She stared at it. "That thing will break under us. Only if we let it." They sprinted toward the crane as the car behind them accelerated. The crane's ladder was slick with rust and moss, but they climbed it anyway, hands slipping, breath ragged, hearts pounding. Below them, the vehicle skidded to a stop. Doors flew open. Flashlights cut through the rain. "Hurry!" Rinaldi yelled. She climbed faster, ignoring the sting of metal biting into her palms. Rain cascaded down the ladder, soaking her coat, the scroll tube, everything. When she reached the first platform, she turned back. Figures were climbing after them. 3 of them. One moved with terrifying agility, no hesitation, no missteps, as if he had climbed far worse structures in his life. Rinaldi reached the platform beside her. "They're gaining on us." He grabbed her and pointed higher, toward the crane's rusted arm stretching over the river. "We run across it. It'll hold long enough." Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating their path. A narrow beam of metal suspended high above the raging water. "We'll die," she whispered. "We'll die if we stay." She nodded once, breath trembling, and stepped onto the crane arm. It shook beneath her weight, slowly at first, then fiercely as a gust of wind slammed into it. The storm swallowed them in a furious roar, the river below churning like the throat of some ancient beast. One step, another, then another. Rinaldi followed close behind. The metal groaned. Rust flaked off beneath her feet. She clutched the tube tightly, praying the ancient scroll inside would survive even if she didn't. Below them, flashlights pointed upward. One of the hunters had reached the ladder. His face was calm, almost serene despite the storm, as if climbing into chaos was ordinary for him. She moved faster. Halfway across, the crane shuddered violently. The arm dipped a full inch under her weight. She gasped and steadied herself. "Keep going," Rinaldi shouted. The wind howled. Rain stung her eyes. Her foot slipped. She caught herself, heart stopping for a moment. The river below seemed to reach for her, swirling hungrily. Behind her, metal clanged. The hunter had reached the crane arm. She didn't dare look back. The arm creaked, groaned. Then, a deafening crack split the storm. The crane arm buckled. The metal beneath her foot dropped a full foot. She cried out, stumbling forward, barely catching her balance. Rinaldi lunged, grabbing her coat and pulling her back from the edge. The hunter dropped to one knee, gripping the crane with effortless strength. "We're not going to make it," she screamed over the wind. "Yes, we will." The far end of the crane arm led to a maintenance roof on the opposite side of the river. A faint light glowed from a small window beneath it. A lifeline. They ran. Every step felt like it would be the one that collapsed the crane completely. Behind them, the hunter rose and moved with terrifying steadiness. "He's too fast," she cried. Rinaldi grabbed a loose pipe from the crane's structure, tore it free with a grunt, and hurled it at the hunter. It clanged off his shoulder, barely slowing him. "Go!" Rinaldi shouted. "Get off the crane!" She ran the last few steps and leapt onto the roof. She rolled across the wet surface, clutching the scroll tube against her chest. "Rinaldi!" she screamed, turning back. He swung his leg onto the roof just as the crane gave way. The entire structure collapsed into the river with a groaning scream of metal. The hunter fell with it, vanishing into the churning black water. Rinaldi scrambled forward, grabbing the edge of the roof as the crane's remains crashed into the waves. "You're okay. You're okay. Pull up," she shouted. He dragged himself fully onto the roof, collapsed beside her, and laughed breathlessly. "We outran them. For now." "For now," she echoed. They crawled toward the small window, pushed it open, and dropped into a dark room filled with old machinery and dust. The storm raged outside, rattling the metal walls, but inside the air was still and quiet. Rinaldi collapsed against a crate. "We can't keep running blind. We need a plan." She nodded, gripping the scroll tube. "We have one. We leave Italy." "Tonight?" he asked. "Yes." "Where?" She opened the tube, unrolled the scroll, and pointed to the last name. A name that glowed in candlelight as though it had been waiting for this moment. A name that echoed with centuries of survival. A name that would change everything. "This is where the bloodline ends," she said softly, "and where it must be protected." Rinaldi leaned closer. "Where do we find him?" She whispered the answer. And for the first time since this began, the path forward was clear. Not safe, not easy, but clear. The heir lived somewhere far from Rome's reach, and she was going to get to him first, before the hunters did, before the church did, before history swallowed him whole. The plane lifted off just as dawn broke across the horizon. Soft gold light spilled over the clouds, illuminating the world below like an ancient map unfurling into morning. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching Rome shrink to a distant geometry of domes and cobblestones. For the first time in days, silence wrapped around her like a blanket. But peace did not follow. Rinaldi sat beside her, hunched, eyes closed, breathing slowly, not sleeping, listening. Every few minutes he opened one eye and scanned the aisle, the passengers, the overhead compartments. He had not spoken much since the night at the crane. Neither of them had. There was too much to think about, too much to fear. She unfastened the strap on the metal tube just enough to rest her hand on it. Feeling the shape of the scroll beneath the metal steadied her. This old, fragile document, this record of centuries, had survived fires, purges, crusades, betrayals. It had waited patiently in the earth. It had waited for her, and now it waited for the air. Her fingers traced the metal's cold surface. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, somewhere in a land of forests, mountains, and ruins untouched by centuries of war, lived a person who carried the last living thread of the forbidden bloodline. Someone who likely did not know a single thing about his ancestry. Someone who had no idea that the Vatican was hunting him. Someone who was just living a life. Ordinary, unaware, unprepared. The thought hollowed her chest. The plane hit light turbulence. She closed her eyes and breathed. When the seatbelt sign switched off, Rinaldi finally opened both eyes. "We'll be in Bucharest in a few hours," he murmured. She nodded. "And from there, we follow the name." She pulled the tube closer and carefully unrolled the scroll just enough to skim its final lines. The name written in the dark ink, placed there long after the rest, seemed to pulse in the morning light, as though alive. A single name, a city, and a symbol beside it, the fractured star. She traced the mark with her fingertip. "This is where he is," she whispered. "It has to be." Rinaldi leaned in, lowering his voice. "You really think the cardinal added this name to lead someone one day?" "Yes," she said simply. "Why else risk updating the scroll? Why else hide it in the hill? Why else send that last letter before he disappeared?" Rinaldi looked out the window, brow furrowed. "We have to assume others know this name too." "Not everyone," she countered. "Only those who had access to the old genealogies. And most of those were destroyed." Then she added softly, "But the Vatican has always had more eyes than we think." Rinaldi didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the truth lay heavy between them. They were not racing against time. They were racing against an institution, a movement, a machine, a centuries-old shadow network that had erased entire branches of a bloodline without leaving a trace. The plane shook again. She glanced toward the aisle. A man in a gray coat had risen from his seat and begun casually walking toward the back. Another passenger, middle-aged, reading a newspaper, lowered the page just enough for her to see his eyes watching them. Her pulse quickened. "They're here," she whispered. Rinaldi didn't turn his head. He simply said, "How many?" "One, maybe two." He exhaled sharply. "We don't land in Bucharest." She blinked. "What?" He pointed toward the flight attendant pushing a cart. "Every plane has an emergency landing protocol. And if someone collapses suddenly..." Her eyes widened. "Rinaldi, you can't..." "I can fake it." He squeezed her hand. "We get off early. We get lost in whatever city they divert to." The idea terrified her. The Vatican hunters were persistent. They were trained. And they had more resources, more reach, more authority than any two people on the run. But Rinaldi was right. If they landed in Bucharest as planned, the hunters would be waiting at the gate. She nodded once. Rinaldi stood abruptly and staggered toward the aisle. The nearest flight attendant hurried toward him. "Sir? Are you okay?" He collapsed at her feet, clutching his chest dramatically. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Within minutes, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "We are preparing for an unscheduled landing. Please remain calm." The plane began to descend. She pretended to be concerned, kneeling beside Rinaldi as attendants rushed to help. She kept her eyes down, but she could feel the two watchers' tension rise. They hadn't expected this. Good. The plane touched down at a small regional airport in Bulgaria, nowhere near their intended destination. As soon as the doors opened, paramedics boarded and lifted Rinaldi onto a stretcher. She followed them off the plane, still gripping the metal tube. When they reached the tarmac, Rinaldi whispered through the corner of his mouth, "Go left. Follow the fence. Don't look back." She mouthed, "Be careful." His lips cracked into a faint smile. "Always." The paramedics pushed him toward the ambulance. She pivoted sharply, moving toward the outer boundary of the airport. Rain had begun to fall again, lightly, like a veil. The sky was gray, low, heavy. She reached the chain-link fence, slipped through a gap torn near the bottom, and emerged onto a deserted access road lined with trees and wild grass. Only then did she dare breathe fully. She turned back. Two men stepped through the airport doors, the watchers from the plane. They scanned the tarmac, searching for her. She crouched behind a rusted maintenance shed, clutching the tube. The men spoke briefly, then moved toward the ambulance. They were hunting Rinaldi now. Her heart wrenched. He had sacrificed himself to buy her time. She watched the ambulance drive away, watched the hunters track it, then forced herself to move. Her hands shook violently as she stepped onto the road that curved into the forest beyond the airport. She whispered, "Hold on, Rinaldi. Please hold on." Then she focused on the scroll. The name, the air, her purpose. She walked faster, the wind whipping her coat. The forest ahead swallowed the road, turning it into a shadowed corridor of pines and bare branches. Somewhere in this wide, ancient part of Europe lived a person who had inherited centuries of suffering, survival, and truth. Someone whose blood carried stories Rome had spent lifetimes burying. She tightened her grip on the scroll tube. "I'm coming," she whispered into the cold air. For the first time, the truth did not feel like weight. It felt like destiny. The train cut through the Carpathian Mountains like a steel needle sewing its way across ancient land. She sat alone, the scroll tube pressed against her chest, unable to sleep. Every forest they passed felt older than memory, as if watching her, waiting. Rinaldi's face haunted her. The stretcher, the hunters stepping closer. She whispered into the cold window, "Please be alive." When the train arrived at a tiny mountain station, she climbed down into snow and silence. Villagers stared as she passed, whispering behind scarves. The road was narrow, climbing toward dense pines and distant smoke. An old man in a truck offered a ride. "That village," he warned, "keeps its secrets." Deep in the mountains she reached it, a place forgotten by maps. Children hid. Dogs barked. The priest sweeping the church steps dropped his broom when she said the name. "You must leave," he whispered. "Men came last night, asking for him, not leaving footprints." Her blood ran cold. She ran toward the forest path he pointed to, boots sinking into snow. The trees swallowed her as she approached a small wooden house with smoke drifting from the chimney. Inside, she heard voices, low, cold, unmistakably Vatican hunters. She pressed against the wall, breath shallow. She was almost too late. Snow pressed against the wooden cabin as she kicked the door open. Two Vatican hunters froze, their grip tightening on the terrified young man cornered against the wall. He looked nothing like a mythical heir, just a confused villager dragged into a nightmare he didn't understand. "Let him go," she said, raising the metal tube like a weapon. "You're too late," one hunter sneered. "He belongs to the church." The heir whimpered. "I don't even know who you think I am." "You're the last of your bloodline," she whispered. The hunters lunged. She swung the tube, striking one in the arm. The heir found courage for a moment, grabbing a fire poker and hitting the other. Chaos erupted. Furniture shattered. The lamp flickered wildly. "Run," she told the heir. He stumbled through the back door into the snow. She followed, but a hunter grabbed her coat, yanking her backward. She elbowed him hard, escaped, and sprinted outside. They ran into the forest, branches slashing their arms. Voices echoed behind them. "Find them!" But deeper in the woods, a strange horn sounded, ancient, resonant. Torches appeared between trees. Hooded figures emerged silently, symbols of the fractured star glowing on their robes. And the hunters stopped.